There is something deeply unsettling about patterns that should not exist. Across continents separated by vast oceans, ancient civilizations told the same stories. They built monuments using techniques that echo one another with unnerving precision. They worshipped gods whose descriptions blur together when you strip away the names: Egypt and Peru, Mesopotamia and Mexico, India and Indonesia. How did cultures with no contact, no shared language, no documented exchange arrive at such similar conclusions about the cosmos, about construction, about the divine? We are told this is coincidence, independent development, the natural result of humans facing similar challenges and reaching similar solutions. But when you stand before the evidence, that explanation begins to feel inadequate. It begins to feel like something we tell ourselves to avoid a more uncomfortable truth. Consider 3 objects, 3 artifacts that exist in museums and archaeological records, yet refuse to fit neatly into the story we have been taught about human progress. The first is a corroded mechanism pulled from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. When researchers finally understood what they were looking at, they discovered an analog computer of such sophistication that nothing comparable would exist for another 1,000 years. It tracked celestial cycles with precision that should have been impossible. The bronze gears, the differential mechanisms, the astronomical knowledge required to conceive it all point to a level of understanding that has no business existing in the ancient world, according to our timeline of human achievement. The second is simpler, almost crude by comparison. A clay jar found near Baghdad, sealed with asphalt, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When tested, it functions as a galvanic cell, a battery. Created nearly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the concept. We do not know what they used it for. We do not know how widespread this knowledge was. We only know it existed when it should not have. The third is not an object but a phenomenon. In certain ancient temples, when you stand in specific locations and speak or clap, the architecture itself responds. The stone amplifies sound in ways that modern acoustic engineers study and struggle to replicate. These were not accidents of construction. They were designed with intention, with knowledge of wave frequencies and resonance that we assume ancient builders could not possess. These 3 examples represent a larger pattern, a pattern of capabilities that appear, then vanish, then appear again centuries later, as if humanity is constantly forgetting and remembering the same lessons. But what if the forgetting was not accidental? Imagine yourself in the Library of Alexandria during those final hours, smoke rising, flames approaching, scribes moving frantically through corridors lined with scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of the known world. They cannot save everything, they must choose. Which knowledge is essential? Which can be sacrificed? Which truths are too dangerous to preserve? And more importantly, which truths are too dangerous to let burn? History tells us the library was lost, that centuries of knowledge turned to ash, and humanity entered a darker age as a result. But what if some knowledge was deliberately removed before the flames arrived? What if certain scrolls were judged too powerful, too destabilizing, too transformative to remain accessible? What if empires across time understood something fundamental, that knowledge, like fire, must sometimes be contained? The greatest achievements of ancient civilizations might not have been lost to time, conquest, or catastrophe. They might have been hidden by design, concealed by those who understood what such knowledge could do in the wrong hands, or even in the right hands at the wrong moment in human development. The question is not whether this happened. The evidence suggests it did, repeatedly, across cultures and centuries. The question is why. And to answer that, we must begin where the practice of writing itself began, where humanity first gained the power to record truth and, just as significantly, the power to obscure it. In every ancient empire, there existed a class of individuals who operated in 2 worlds simultaneously. To the common people, they were priests, intermediaries between humanity and the divine. But within the inner sanctums of their temples, away from public eyes, they were something else entirely. They were scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians. They measured the movements of stars, dissected the principles of mathematics, experimented with chemistry and medicine. Their white robes and ceremonial titles concealed laboratories disguised as holy chambers. This duality was not deception in the way we might understand it. It was design, intentional architecture of knowledge management that appeared across civilizations with no apparent connection to one another. The Egyptians called their institutions the House of Life. These were not temples in the spiritual sense, though they existed within temple complexes. They were academies where initiated priests studied texts on surgery, astronomy, engineering, and natural philosophy. Access was restricted, knowledge was guarded. A physician priest might spend decades learning medical procedures that would never be written down for public consumption, passed instead through direct instruction, from master to student, in rooms where outsiders never entered. The same pattern emerges in Mesopotamia, where temple complexes housed astronomical observatories and mathematical research. In India, where certain texts were deemed suitable only for initiated students. In China, where imperial astronomers served the court but kept their methods secret. The specifics varied by culture, but the structure remained consistent. A division between public ritual and private knowledge. Between what the masses were told and what the keepers understood. We look at ancient texts describing what they called magic or divine power, and we dismiss them as superstition. But when you examine these descriptions closely, something curious emerges. They are often precise accounts of natural phenomena, deliberately clothed in mystical language. A chemical reaction described as divine transformation. Acoustic properties presented as the voice of gods. Mathematical principles embedded in creation myths. The language was designed to obscure as much as to preserve. Why would they do this? The easy answer is control. Knowledge is power, and restricting access maintains hierarchy. But the deeper you explore, the more you find evidence suggesting something more complex. These keepers left behind warnings, documents expressing genuine concern about what they called dangerous knowledge. Philosophical debates recorded on clay tablets and papyrus, where scholars argued about whether humanity was ready for certain truths. They were not simply hoarding information for privilege. They understood something about the relationship between knowledge and societal stability. They grasped that certain capabilities, in the wrong hands or introduced at the wrong stage of cultural development, could destabilize everything. It was not cruelty that motivated concealment. It was responsibility. Or at least, that is what their own writings suggest. And they did something else, something that reveals an unexpected faith in the future. They left clues, encoded information in monuments that would survive the collapse of empires. Mathematical constants hidden in architecture. Astronomical data embedded in myth, symbolic systems that could be decoded by those who developed the capacity to understand them. It was not random. It was deliberate communication across time, a message waiting for recipients who would not be born for thousands of years. The trail still exists, in the proportions of ancient structures, in the recurring symbols that appear across disconnected cultures. In texts that reveal different meanings when approached with different frameworks of understanding. The keepers of yesterday did not simply hide knowledge. They preserved it in forms that would only become visible when humanity reached the necessary level of sophistication to recognize what it was seeing. The question now is whether we have reached that level, whether we can see what they left for us to find. And to answer that, we must travel to the place where this entire system began. Where writing itself was born, and with it, the first true empire of secrets. The ancients did not hide their secrets in locked vaults behind guarded doors. They placed them in full view, written in texts that anyone could read, carved into monuments visited by thousands. The concealment was not in access, but in comprehension. The same words meant different things depending on who was reading them and what they had been taught to see. A scribe in ancient Sumer or Egypt learned to write on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface narrative served one purpose: religious instruction, moral teaching, cultural mythology. But beneath that surface, for those trained to recognize it, lay something else: mathematical relationships, astronomical observations, descriptions of natural processes using metaphorical language that could survive translation, transcription, and even the fall of the civilization that created it. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh. On its surface, a hero's journey, a quest for immortality, friendship and loss, and the acceptance of human mortality. Scholars have studied it as literature, as the foundation of narrative structure, as insight into Mesopotamian culture. But recently, researchers analyzing the text with astronomical software noticed something. The journey of Gilgamesh maps onto the precession of the equinoxes. The encounters correspond to constellations. The timeline of the story encodes celestial cycles that require centuries of observation to calculate. The epic was not just a story, it was a star chart disguised as mythology. Egyptian temple reliefs present another example. Beautiful hieroglyphic scenes covering massive walls depicting gods and pharaohs and religious ceremonies. Tourists photograph them. Scholars translate the obvious meanings. But certain temples, when measured precisely, reveal that the spacing of columns, the proportions of chambers, the relationships between elements encode mathematical constants. Pi appears in the ratios. Phi manifests in the layouts, not approximately, precisely. These were not decorative choices or lucky accidents. They were deliberate embedding of mathematical knowledge into structures designed to outlast the civilization itself. Sanskrit texts describe what they call anu and paramanu, concepts often translated vaguely as atoms or particles. The descriptions read like poetry, which is how they have been approached. But when physicists actually analyze what these ancient texts are describing, they find remarkably accurate models of atomic structure and behavior, written thousands of years before such concepts supposedly entered human understanding. The poetry was camouflage, the knowledge was real. Consider creation myths more carefully. They are dismissed as primitive attempts to explain origins, pre-scientific narratives, before humanity understood geology or cosmology. But when you map certain creation stories onto what we now know about planetary formation, tectonic processes, the evolution of atmospheres, the sequence aligns with disturbing accuracy. Ancient texts from multiple cultures describe the Earth forming from chaos, layers separating, water covering everything, then land emerging. They describe this in the correct order. The order that modern geology confirms occurred over billions of years. How could they know the sequence without understanding the processes? The answer lies in what we might call symbolic preservation. The keepers understood that languages die, empires fall, libraries burn, but symbols persist, architecture endures. Stories survive through oral tradition, even when writing is lost. So they encoded the most critical knowledge, not in explicit technical manuals that could be destroyed or misunderstood, but in myths, monuments, and mathematical relationships that would survive catastrophe. Modern researchers are developing new tools to decode these ancient messages. Computer analysis reveals patterns invisible to human observation. Astronomical software can check whether ancient structures align with celestial events. Chemical analysis can determine whether temple stones were chosen for their mineral properties rather than convenience. With each new technology, we uncover another layer of intention, another instance where what appeared decorative or religious reveals itself as technical and precise. The most extraordinary possibility is this: the most important encoded knowledge may be hidden in the most visited places. Millions walk past it annually. They photograph it, study it superficially, then move on, never realizing they are standing inside a library written in a language we are only now beginning to read. And it all begins in one place. The civilization that gave us writing itself, that rose from the plains between two rivers and built the first cities, recorded the first laws, mapped the first stars. They called their land the place where civilization began. What they did not say, but left for us to discover, is what they knew before that beginning. There is a document that makes historians uncomfortable. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it exists in multiple copies discovered across Mesopotamia, which means it was not an isolated text, but something widely distributed, officially recognized. The document begins with kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years per reign. Then it describes a great flood, And after that flood, the reign lengths suddenly become realistic, reasonable, human. The conventional response is to dismiss the early entries as mythology, exaggeration, symbolic representation of something we cannot quite determine. But the document treats all entries with the same matter-of-fact tone. It does not distinguish between the mythological and the historical. It presents itself as a straightforward chronology, and the Sumerians themselves seem to regard it that way. So what were they actually recording? Some scholars suggest it represents compressed history, with single names standing in for entire dynasties. Others propose it reflects a different understanding of time measurement, that their years meant something different than ours. A few suggest something more unsettling, that the list preserves memory of an earlier civilization whose timeline we do not understand, whose records the Sumerians inherited and faithfully copied without fully comprehending what they contained. The debate remains unresolved because we keep finding tablets that refuse to fit comfortably into our assumptions about what ancient people could know. In museum collections across the world sit clay tablets covered in cuneiform wedges. Many have been translated, many more have not. And among those that have been studied, several contain information that should not exist. Astronomical calculations, tracking cycles that require centuries of continuous observation. Mathematical concepts that would not be rediscovered until the 20th century. Medical procedures describing human anatomy in ways that suggest dissection and experimentation we have no other evidence they performed. In 1936, a single tablet entered the collection of a New York publisher who donated it to Columbia University. It became known as Plimpton 322. For years, scholars recognized it contained numbers arranged in columns, but its purpose remained unclear. Then mathematicians began analyzing the relationships between the figures. What they discovered stopped them cold. The tablet contained trigonometric tables, not approximations, not primitive attempts at calculation. Sophisticated trigonometry expressed in base 60 mathematics, accurate and systematic. This was more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras, whom we credit with founding the field. The tablet was not an isolated experiment or lucky accident. It was clearly part of a larger mathematical tradition, a fragment of a systematic approach to geometry and calculation that implied extensive prior development. When mathematicians describe their reaction to understanding what they were seeing, they use words like unsettling and impossible, because the tablet was created around 1700 years before the Common Era. It meant that mathematical concepts we teach as modern innovations, as products of Greek and later European development, already existed in Mesopotamia at a level of sophistication that suggests they were working with principles we thought we invented. The competing theories about how this is possible range from conservative to radical. Perhaps the Sumerians and their successors were simply more advanced than we have credited, their intellectual achievements obscured by the fragmentary nature of what survives. Perhaps they developed observational and mathematical techniques we do not understand and therefore cannot recognize in the archaeological record. Or perhaps they had access to knowledge from an even earlier source, preserving and building upon information inherited from a civilization we have not yet identified. What makes this more than speculation is a detail that often goes unmentioned. Many tablets from this period were found deliberately buried in temple foundations. Not discarded, not lost. Buried with care, sealed in clay jars, placed in locations designed to preserve them. This was not storage for contemporary use. This was preservation for the future. The Sumerians were creating time capsules, ensuring that certain knowledge would survive even if their civilization did not. It suggests they knew something we are only now beginning to suspect, that civilizations are fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that what one generation understands, the next might forget. So they took precautions, embedding their most important insights into the most durable medium they possessed, then hiding those records where they might survive catastrophe. Thousands of tablets sit in museum storage, uncatalogued or untranslated. There are perhaps a dozen scholars in the world with the linguistic expertise to read them. Each year, a few more are studied. And with each translation, the timeline of human knowledge shifts backward. The capabilities of ancient civilizations expand beyond what we thought possible. The question is no longer whether the Sumerians possessed advanced knowledge. The evidence is clear that they did. The question is where that knowledge came from, and what else they knew that we have not yet rediscovered in the clay fragments scattered across museums and private collections, waiting for someone to finally understand what they contain. The length of a lunar month, measured with modern instruments and atomic clocks, is 29.530588 days. This is the figure we arrive at using telescopes, computers, and centuries of accumulated astronomical data. The Babylonians calculated it as 29.530594 days. The difference is less than 1 second. They achieved this precision using nothing but their eyes and clay tablets to record what they saw. When you first encounter this fact, it seems improbable. When you understand what it actually requires, it becomes nearly impossible to explain. To calculate the lunar cycle this accurately through naked eye observation demands more than mathematical skill. It requires continuous observation spanning not years or decades but centuries. Multiple generations of astronomers carefully recording lunar positions, comparing observations, refining calculations, passing their data and methods to successors who continue the work. It demands an institutional structure dedicated to knowledge preservation that exceeds anything we see in medieval Europe or most other civilizations throughout history. The Babylonians possessed exactly such a structure. Priest astronomers worked from observatories built atop ziggurats, the massive step temples that dominated their cities. These were not mystics seeking omens in the stars. They were researchers conducting systematic scientific observation, funded by the state, trained through rigorous apprenticeship, maintaining records across generations. They tracked planets, calculated cycles, predicted celestial events with precision that would not be matched again until the telescope was invented. We know this because their tablets survive. Ephemerides, they are called, astronomical tables, predicting planetary positions years into the future. And when modern astronomers check these ancient predictions against computer models of historical celestial mechanics, they find them accurate. Disturbingly accurate. Recently translated tablets reveal something even more remarkable. Babylonian astronomers were using geometric methods to calculate Jupiter's position and velocity. They divided time into segments and calculated the area under velocity curves to determine position. This is a sophisticated mathematical technique that would not appear again until 14th century mathematicians at Oxford developed similar approaches. Except the Babylonians were doing it 2,000 years earlier. The question that keeps emerging is not whether they possessed this knowledge. The tablets prove they did. The question is how, and more troublingly, why did it disappear? After Babylon fell, astronomical precision collapsed. The techniques were lost. Subsequent civilizations had to rebuild astronomical understanding from fragments, from scratch in some cases. By the medieval period, European astronomy was far less sophisticated than what Babylon had achieved over a millennium earlier. How does an entire scientific tradition, supported by institutional structures and documented in thousands of tablets, simply vanish? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding what this knowledge was used for. The obvious applications were calendrical, agricultural timing, religious festivals, but evidence suggests the Babylonians were doing something more. Their astronomical precision appears connected to navigation, to coordinating activities across vast distances, to a level of organizational sophistication that required accurate timekeeping and positional awareness beyond what we typically associate with ancient empires. Some tablets contain predictions extending not years, but centuries into the future. Calculations for celestial events that would occur long after the civilization that created them had fallen. When you input these ancient predictions into modern astronomical software and check them against what actually occurred in those dates, now centuries in our past, you find they were correct. The Babylonians were successfully predicting astronomical events 1,000 years into their own future, which raises an uncomfortable question. If their mathematical models could accurately project that far forward, what else did they calculate? What other predictions might exist on tablets still untranslated, sitting in storage, describing events in what would have been their distant future, but is our present or recent past? The precision of their astronomy suggests institutional knowledge preservation exceeding most civilizations in history. The sophistication of their methods suggests mathematical understanding that would not be rediscovered for 2 millennia. And the accuracy of their long-range predictions suggests they understood celestial mechanics at a level we associate with post-telescope science. But the Babylonians themselves did not claim to have invented this knowledge. Their own records consistently reference earlier sources. They speak of wisdom inherited from the land of Sumer, from the cities that existed before the flood, from a time before Babylon when the foundations of astronomical knowledge were laid. They saw themselves not as innovators but as preservers, maintaining and expanding upon a tradition whose origins stretched back beyond memory into an age when, according to their own accounts, the gods themselves taught humanity to read the heavens. Around 4,300 years ago, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity to build the world's first empire. He conquered the scattered city-states of Mesopotamia, established a capital at Akkad, and created an administrative structure that would become the template for every empire that followed. This is the story as it appears in textbooks: military conquest, political consolidation, the birth of imperial administration. But something else happened during the Akkadian period that historians mention far less frequently, something that might be more significant than any military campaign. The Akkadians began systematically collecting knowledge. Newly translated administrative tablets reveal a program that looks remarkably like organized research. Sargon and his successors sent scribes throughout their territories with specific instructions to locate, copy, and translate texts from conquered peoples. This was not random looting of libraries. It was methodical acquisition. Scribes were dispatched to collect information on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, metallurgy. They were told to find the oldest texts available, the ones that local priests and scholars considered most important, most ancient. These collected works were brought to Akkad, translated into Akkadian if necessary, copied multiple times, and stored in what became the first true libraries. Not personal collections of a wealthy individual, but state-sponsored repositories organized by subject matter, catalogued, maintained by professional scribes whose job was preservation and transmission of knowledge. The Akkadian language itself became something unexpected. For over 1,000 years after the Akkadian Empire fell, their language remained the diplomatic tongue of the ancient Near East. Kings from Egypt to Persia conducted correspondence in Akkadian. Treaties were written in Akkadian, but more importantly for our purposes, knowledge was recorded and transmitted in Akkadian. It became the medium through which astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, and medical knowledge passed between cultures and across centuries. This was not accidental. The Akkadians deliberately positioned their language as the vehicle for knowledge preservation. And in doing so, they created a continuity that allowed information to survive political upheavals, the collapse of civilizations, the rise and fall of dynasties. Among the texts preserved in Akkadian are documents called wisdom literature. These are presented as ancient knowledge, and many explicitly state they are recording information from before the flood. Scholars debate what this means. Some interpret it as purely mythological, a way of giving texts authority by claiming ancient origins. Others suggest it references actual historical memory of catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. A few propose something more intriguing, that the Akkadians were preserving knowledge from an earlier civilization, about which we know almost nothing. That civilization might be what archaeologists call the Ubaid culture. They existed in southern Mesopotamia before the Sumerians, before written history begins. We know they built settlements, practiced agriculture, created pottery, but we know remarkably little about their intellectual achievements, their level of sophistication. Yet the foundations of Mesopotamian civilization, the irrigation systems, the astronomical observations, the mathematical frameworks seem to rest on Ubaid-era developments that we can barely trace because they predate writing. What makes the Akkadian preservation effort particularly fascinating are the marginal notes. Scribes copying ancient texts sometimes added comments. These annotations have survived on many tablets, and they reveal something unexpected. The scribes did not always understand what they were copying. They left notes, expressing confusion about measurements, awe at calculations, uncertainty about technical terms. They were faithfully reproducing information whose significance they recognized but whose full meaning eluded them. They were preserving knowledge they could not entirely comprehend, maintaining it for a future they hoped would understand better than they did. When the Akkadian Empire finally collapsed around 4,150 years ago, there is clear evidence of deliberate preservation efforts. Tablets were sealed in clay jars and buried in foundations. Libraries were carefully closed and hidden. Information was deposited in locations that suggest the keepers knew their civilization was ending and were determined that the knowledge would survive. They succeeded. Much of what the Babylonians knew, they inherited from Akkadian libraries. Much of what we know about Sumerian civilization comes through Akkadian copies and translations. The empire fell, but the knowledge persisted, encoded in a language that continued to be read and written for another 1,000 years, carrying forward observations and calculations that reach back to sources even the Akkadians considered ancient. And those sources consistently pointed westward, toward a civilization that would take this practice of knowledge encoding to heights the Mesopotamian cultures could only approximate. A civilization whose monuments would become humanity's most enduring puzzles, whose priests would perfect the art of hiding truth in plain sight, whose legacy would dominate human imagination for millennia. Before we discuss the pyramids, we need to talk about boxes. Enormous granite boxes in an underground chamber called the Serapeum of Saqqara. Each box weighs approximately 70 tons. They sit in darkness beneath the Egyptian sand, and most tourists never see them. Those who do typically photograph them and move on, assuming they are sarcophagi, burial containers for sacred bulls. But when engineers examine these boxes closely, something disturbing emerges. The surfaces are flat to within tolerances, measured in thousandths of an inch. The corners meet at perfect right angles. The interior walls run parallel to exterior walls with a precision that modern machine shops would struggle to achieve. One engineer spent weeks attempting to replicate a single surface using period-appropriate copper tools. He failed. The granite would not yield to copper in any configuration he attempted. The precision remained inexplicable. This is not the most famous mystery of ancient Egypt, but it might be the most important, because precision of this magnitude is not decorative. It serves a purpose. When you machine a surface to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, you are creating something functional, something that requires that exact specification to operate correctly. We simply do not know what that function was. The same problem appears everywhere in Egyptian architecture once you start looking for it. Pyramid blocks that fit together so precisely that you cannot slide paper between them. Stones cut at complex angles that interlock in ways that seem designed to distribute force or resonate with specific frequencies. Chambers aligned to cardinal directions with accuracy that requires sophisticated astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. The standard explanation involves copper tools, sand abrasives, and unlimited labor. But when modern engineers attempt to replicate Egyptian stonework using these methods, they consistently fail to match the precision. Not approximately, they fail entirely. The tools we believe they used cannot produce the results we can measure in their surviving work, which suggests either we are wrong about their tools, or we are wrong about what they were building. Recent discoveries point toward the second possibility. Ground-penetrating radar reveals that the pyramids sit above underground water systems, channels and chambers that appear deliberately constructed. The stones themselves exhibit unusual electromagnetic properties that vary by location within the structure. In certain chambers, acoustic phenomena occur. Sounds at specific frequencies amplify in ways that require sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and resonance. These are not features you would accidentally create while building a tomb. They suggest intentionality. Design specifications that served purposes we do not understand because we have been asking the wrong questions. We ask how they built the pyramids. We debate ramp systems and labor organization. We calculate how many workers would be needed to move, how many stones over how many years. But perhaps the more revealing question is what they were building. Not who was buried there, but what the structure was designed to do. The mathematical relationships encoded in pyramid dimensions point toward this question. The ratio of height to base perimeter approximates pi. The relationship between different pyramid dimensions encodes phi, the golden ratio. The latitude of the Great Pyramid relates to the speed of light when expressed in ancient measurement systems. These are not coincidences. There are too many of them, too precisely executed, appearing across multiple structures. The Egyptians were encoding information into architecture, but they were also building devices, structures designed to interact with electromagnetic fields, with sound frequencies, with underground water. We can measure these properties. We simply cannot determine what they were meant to accomplish. Modern technology continues revealing more. Ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic surveys, and acoustic analysis discover new chambers, new voids, new structures beneath the Giza Plateau. And consistently, Egyptian authorities restrict access. Permits for excavation are denied. Proposals to open sealed chambers are refused. The official explanation involves preservation and caution. But the pattern of restriction raises questions about what might be found and why discovery might be unwelcome. The precision of Egyptian stonework is not the mystery. The mystery is why such precision was necessary. What were they building that required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch? What purposes did these massive stone structures serve beyond monumental architecture? And what knowledge did their architects possess that allowed them to encode mathematical constants, astronomical alignments, and functional specifications into monuments that would outlast their civilization by millennia? The Egyptians had a god of wisdom named Thoth. According to their mythology, he invented writing, recorded the knowledge of the cosmos, and hid this knowledge in secret libraries scattered across Egypt, accessible only to those deemed worthy. For centuries, this was treated as pure mythology, colourful stories from a culture that explained everything through divine intervention. Then archaeologists began discovering what the Egyptians called houses of life. These were not temples in the conventional sense. They were institutions attached to temple complexes, but they served entirely different purposes. Medical schools, observatories, research centres, libraries containing texts on surgery, astronomy, chemistry, mathematics. Access was restricted to initiated priests who studied there for years, learning to read not just hieroglyphics, but the deeper meanings encoded within them. The evidence suggests these institutions existed across Egypt for thousands of years, maintaining continuous traditions of knowledge, preservation, and transmission. When the Greeks arrived and built the famous Library of Alexandria, they were not creating something new. They were consolidating, bringing together and organizing collections that had existed in Egyptian temple libraries for millennia. Alexandria was the culmination of an Egyptian tradition, not a Greek innovation. Surviving papyri from these libraries contain knowledge that seems impossibly advanced. Medical texts describe surgical procedures with detailed instructions and success rate predictions that modern physicians find remarkably accurate. Astronomical papyri contain calculations requiring observational data spanning centuries. Chemical formulas describe processes for creating compounds and materials that modern chemists struggle to reproduce using the ingredients specified. One collection of texts deserves particular attention: the Hermetic writings, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which is Greek for thrice great Hermes. The name itself is revealing. Hermes was the Greek god associated with knowledge and communication. Trismegistus was their interpretation of Thoth. These texts claim to preserve Egyptian wisdom, and they contain knowledge of chemistry, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy that modern analysis suggests predates the texts themselves by considerable time. The theory that emerges from studying these documents is that they represent copies of copies, information transcribed across generations by scribes who maintained the tradition of preservation even when they did not fully understand what they were preserving. The knowledge encoded in Hermetic texts appears older than the manuscripts, suggesting they are fragments of a much larger body of wisdom that once existed in Egyptian temple libraries. Greek writers who visited Egypt and interacted with Egyptian priests left accounts that historians have largely dismissed. They describe being told about forbidden books, texts containing dangerous knowledge that could not be shared with foreigners or uninitiated individuals, libraries that existed but which the Greeks were not permitted to see. These accounts were treated as exaggeration or misunderstanding, but the pattern is consistent across multiple independent sources separated by centuries. What happened to these forbidden collections? Some were certainly destroyed. Libraries burn, temples are looted, knowledge is lost. But evidence suggests a more deliberate process of concealment. Texts were translated into increasingly symbolic language. Information was encoded using interpretive frameworks that required specific training to decode. Multiple valid readings were embedded into single hieroglyphic inscriptions, with different meanings accessible depending on the lens through which they were read. This was sophisticated encryption, not hiding the texts physically, but obscuring their meaning so thoroughly that they could survive in plain sight, readable only by those who possessed the interpretive keys. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern survey technologies reveal extensive underground structures beneath known Egyptian sites. Chambers that have never been opened, tunnels leading to locations we cannot access. Several ancient texts specifically reference hidden libraries, providing descriptions of locations where knowledge was sealed away. Some of these locations sit beneath modern Cairo. Others are in areas where excavation requires permits that Egyptian authorities do not grant. The pattern repeats across Egypt. Temples with sealed chambers that have never been opened. Sites where geophysical surveys show obvious man-made structures underground, but where excavation is prohibited or indefinitely delayed. The official explanations involve preservation, concern about structural integrity, protection of archaeological context. But when you examine which sites receive permits and which do not, a different pattern emerges. Locations unlikely to contain sensitive information are excavated. Locations specifically mentioned in ancient texts as hiding places for forbidden knowledge remain untouched. The Egyptian priests who told Greek visitors about forbidden books appear to have been telling the truth, and the systematic effort to ensure those books would never be found seems to have largely succeeded. The knowledge remains hidden, if it still exists at all, buried beneath sand and stone and modern construction, waiting in darkness for a discovery that may never be permitted to occur. There is something unusual about the Sphinx. Geologists examining the erosion patterns on its body and the walls of its enclosure notice something that does not match the rest of the Giza Plateau. The weathering appears to be caused by water, not wind and sand, which is what you would expect in a desert, but sustained rainfall. Heavy rainfall over long periods. The problem is that the Sahara has been arid for roughly 5,000 years. The last time the region experienced the kind of rainfall that would produce the erosion visible on the Sphinx was before 7,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. If the geological evidence is correct, the Sphinx predates Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. It would have been ancient when the pharaohs found it. Mainstream archaeology has resisted this conclusion despite the geological evidence. The resistance is understandable. Accepting it would require revising the entire chronology of human civilization in Egypt. But the evidence remains. The erosion patterns exist. They require explanation. This connects to a larger mystery that historians mention less frequently. Egyptian civilization appears remarkably fully formed. The pre-dynastic period shows scattered agricultural villages, relatively simple structures, basic tools. Then, suddenly, within what seems like a historically brief transition, we see sophisticated architecture, complex mathematics, advanced astronomy, hierarchical administration, and written language all emerging nearly simultaneously. The conventional explanation is rapid development, a flowering of human innovation compressed into a few centuries. But when you examine the evidence more closely, another possibility emerges. Perhaps they were not developing these capabilities from scratch. Perhaps they were inheriting them. At Abydos sits a structure called the Osirion, massive blocks of granite and limestone, precisely fitted using techniques that appear more sophisticated than later Egyptian work. Yet it sits buried deep beneath structures of known age, suggesting it predates them. The construction method differs from classic Egyptian architecture. The precision of the stonework exceeds what the Egyptians themselves achieved in later periods. It appears to be a remnant of something older, incorporated into Egyptian civilization rather than created by it. There is also the inventory stela, a stone tablet that mainstream archaeology largely dismisses. It claims the Sphinx already existed when a certain pharaoh began his reign. It states that pyramids stood before he ruled. If authentic, it contradicts the conventional chronology entirely. Scholars debate its age and authenticity, but the debate itself reveals discomfort with evidence that does not fit established timelines. Egyptian texts consistently reference something they called the first time, a golden age before recorded history, a period when gods walked among humans and knowledge was pure and complete. For generations, this was dismissed as mythology. But what if it represents cultural memory? What if the Egyptians preserved stories about an earlier civilization from which they inherited their knowledge? Certain sites show clear evidence of construction in multiple phases. Older work demonstrating precision and sophistication. Later additions that are less precise, almost crude by comparison. This is the opposite of what we expect. Civilizations should improve their capabilities over time, not decline. Yet the pattern appears repeatedly. The oldest work is the most impressive. If Egypt inherited knowledge, what happened to the source culture? Egyptian texts provide an answer that historians have largely ignored. They describe catastrophes, great floods that destroyed cities, fires that consumed everything. Destruction so complete that only fragments of knowledge survived. These accounts appear across multiple texts, separated by centuries, consistently describing a time before Egypt, when civilization existed and was destroyed. The Egyptian obsession with preserving knowledge begins to make sense in this context. They were not paranoid. They had learned from predecessors what happens when knowledge is lost. They had inherited fragments from a culture that lost nearly everything. They were determined not to repeat that failure. Recent discoveries continue challenging conventional chronology. Chemical analysis of certain stones suggests ages that do not match archaeological assumptions. Underwater structures off the Egyptian coast show clear signs of human construction, yet they sit at depths that would require them to be far older than accepted timelines allow. Sonar and radar reveal formations that geological processes alone cannot explain. The most telling detail might be what is not being investigated. Full excavation of the Sphinx enclosure has been blocked for decades. Permits are not granted. Proposals are denied. The stated reasons involve preservation and caution, but the effect is that definitive answers to these questions cannot be obtained. Evidence that might confirm or refute the water erosion theory remains buried, inaccessible, beyond the reach of independent verification. The ancient Egyptians built their civilization on foundations that were already ancient. They preserved knowledge from a time before their own history began. They encoded that knowledge into monuments designed to survive catastrophe, because they knew catastrophe was possible. They had seen what remained after it happened once before. In southeastern Turkey sits a structure that should not exist, Göbekli Tepe, massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs, precisely positioned according to astronomical alignments. It was built 11,600 years ago. This predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates agriculture, permanent settlements, pottery, metallurgy, and everything we associate with civilization capable of such construction. When archaeologists first understood what they had found, it required rewriting the timeline of human architectural achievement. But Göbekli Tepe is only the beginning of a much larger pattern. Travel west to the British Isles. Newgrange and Stonehenge display construction using massive stones, astronomical alignments to solstices and equinoxes, geometric precision in their layouts. Move south to the Mediterranean. Malta's temples show sophisticated understanding of acoustics and astronomy, built with stones weighing many tons fitted with precision. Cross the Atlantic to Peru. Sacsayhuam displays walls of polygonal blocks fitted so precisely that blades cannot slide between them. Each stone a different shape, yet interlocking perfectly without mortar. Continue to Easter Island. Massive platforms supporting equally massive statues constructed using techniques that baffle modern engineers travel to Japan. Underwater off Yonaguni lie formations that appear carved and arranged, terraces and right angles that geological processes struggle to explain naturally. Move to Indonesia. Gunung Padang shows evidence of construction in layers, the deepest potentially dating back over 20,000 years. The techniques are remarkably similar. Massive stones, often polygonal rather than rectangular, fitted without mortar yet so precisely that nothing can penetrate the joints. Astronomical alignments built into the structures tracking solstices, equinoxes, specific star positions. Geometric proportions appearing repeatedly, specific ratios and angles showing up across continents. And acoustic properties, chambers and passages that amplify or modify sound in ways that require deliberate design. Conventional archaeology explains this as independent development, similar problems producing similar solutions. Humans everywhere learning to move large stones, align to celestial events, build monuments to gods or kings. But when engineers analyze these structures, the similarities go deeper than general technique. The specific methods, the particular geometric relationships, the acoustic properties, these are not obvious solutions that any culture would naturally discover. They are sophisticated applications of principles that require extensive experimentation and mathematical understanding to develop. The question archaeology has difficulty addressing is purpose. These structures are labeled temples or monuments, but many show no evidence of religious use, no altars, no ritual objects. Instead, they demonstrate properties that suggest practical functions. Electromagnetic anomalies measurable with modern instruments. Acoustic effects that occur at specific frequencies. Alignments that track celestial cycles with precision exceeding what ceremonial purposes would require. Recent research reveals patterns. Megalithic sites positioned at specific intervals. Acoustic properties that could facilitate long-distance communication. Electromagnetic properties that some researchers theorize relate to ancient technologies we no longer understand or associate with Stone Age cultures. One theory attempts to explain the global distribution. During the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. Vast coastal plains existed, where now there is only ocean. If a maritime civilization existed during that period, utilizing those now submerged lands, their coastal settlements would be underwater today. Only inland or elevated sites would remain visible. This explains the underwater structures, Yonaguni's terraces and right angles, formations off the Indian coast near Dwarka showing signs of urban planning, structures discovered off Cuba at depths suggesting great age. These are dismissed as natural formations, despite features that appear architectural. Proposals for full excavation and definitive analysis are consistently denied. Carbon dating that suggests ages contradicting conventional chronology is labeled contaminated. Researchers pursuing these questions report funding disappearing and professional consequences. What cannot be dismissed are the oral traditions. Indigenous cultures across every continent tell stories of a time before the Great Flood, an age when ancestors possessed knowledge and capabilities since lost. When the waters rose and the old world drowned, these were treated as myths, unconnected stories that primitive cultures independently created. But archaeological discoveries keep validating these traditions, sites dating earlier than previous estimates. Evidence of sophisticated cultures existing before conventional timelines suggested civilization was possible. Underwater structures positioned where oral traditions said ancient cities stood before the flooding. The same building techniques appearing across 5 continents, separated by oceans. In an age before we believe humans capable of ocean crossing. Unless the oceans were not always barriers. Unless the ancestors remembered in those oral traditions actually existed, possessed the knowledge these structures demonstrate, and disappeared when their world was drowned beneath rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. There is a ratio that appears throughout nature, in the spiral of a nautilus shell, in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, in the proportions of the human body. We call it phi, the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. It represents a mathematical relationship that creates natural balance and efficiency. This ratio appears in Greek architecture, which is well documented and understood, but it also appears in the Great Pyramid of Giza, in the temple complexes of pre-Columbian America, in ancient Indian structures, in buildings separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years constructed by cultures with no contact. The Great Pyramid encodes more than phi. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base approximates pi to remarkable accuracy. When you measure the pyramid in ancient Egyptian units called royal cubits and examine the relationship between specific dimensions, the number that emerges corresponds to the speed of light in modern measurement, not approximately. The correlation is precise enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires ignoring the mathematical improbability. At Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the temple dimensions encode Earth's precessional cycle. This is the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis, a cycle that requires centuries of astronomical observation to detect and calculate. The temple measurements, when properly analyzed, reflect this cycle in their proportions. The builders either knew this astronomical constant or accidentally created a structure whose dimensions happened to encode it perfectly. Mayan pyramids in Central America incorporate geometric relationships identical to those found in Egyptian structures. The same angles, the same proportional systems, the same mathematical constants embedded in dimensions that appear decorative until you measure them precisely and discover the relationships they encode. These are not simple proportions that might arise naturally from practical construction. A right angle is practical, a circular arch is practical. But encoding the speed of light, the precessional cycle, and multiple mathematical constants into architectural dimensions serves no practical purpose unless you are deliberately preserving that information in the only permanent medium available: stone that will outlast your civilization. Researchers analyzing thousands of ancient structures find statistical clustering around specific mathematical values. When you examine enough buildings, you can calculate the probability of certain proportions appearing by chance. The clustering observed in ancient architecture exceeds what random chance would produce by orders of magnitude. The patterns are statistically significant, which means they represent intentional design rather than accident. The ancient measurement systems themselves reveal something peculiar. Multiple cultures, separated by oceans, used base 60 and base 360 mathematical systems. These are inconvenient for everyday calculation. Try dividing your grocery bill using base 60. But these systems are essential for astronomical calculation, for tracking celestial cycles and angular measurements. They suggest inheritance from or contact with a culture whose primary concern was observing and calculating celestial mechanics. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these structures goes beyond simple solar alignment. The 26,000-year precessional cycle appears in structures from Egypt to Central America, specific stellar alignments that only function correctly for dates thousands of years before the structure's supposed construction. Calendar systems achieving accuracy that requires centuries of continuous observation to develop, yet appearing fully formed in the earliest examples we can date. Certain structures encode information about Earth's dimensions. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter, when multiplied by specific factors embedded in its geometry, produces the polar radius of Earth. The structure contains in its proportions a scale model of the northern hemisphere. This requires knowing Earth's size and shape with precision we believe didn't exist until satellite measurements. Attempts to explain these patterns as coincidence become increasingly untenable as more examples accumulate. Statistical analysis demonstrates that the probability of these relationships occurring randomly approaches zero. Either every ancient culture independently discovered the same sophisticated mathematical constants and chose to encode them in architecture using the same methods, or they inherited this knowledge from a common source. One theory proposes that ancient builders were preserving information they did not fully understand. Sacred knowledge passed down through generations, copied faithfully into stone because it was considered important, without the copiers comprehending what the numbers actually represented. The information survived because it was treated as sacred, even when its meaning was lost. Modern measurement technology continues revealing more. Laser surveying detects proportions invisible to previous analysis. Computer modeling finds mathematical relationships human observation missed. With each technological advance, the pattern strengthens. Ancient structures across continents appear designed using a common mathematical framework encoding constants and relationships that shouldn't have been known, couldn't have been calculated with available tools, yet demonstrably exist in the architecture. The mathematics point towards shared knowledge. But mathematics alone cannot transmit culture, cannot explain why distant peoples built similar structures or told similar stories. For that, we must examine what they said about themselves, about their origins, about where their knowledge came from. And those stories dismissed for centuries as primitive mythology may contain more literal truth than we have been willing to acknowledge. Over 200 cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell essentially the same story. A great flood destroyed the world. Advanced civilization existed before. A few survivors preserved knowledge. They taught primitive peoples to rebuild. The details vary by culture, but the core narrative remains consistent across continents, across time, in societies with no documented contact. For centuries, this was dismissed as coincidence. Universal human fear of water producing similar cautionary tales. Primitive attempts to explain geological features or seasonal flooding. But when you examine these stories carefully, the consistency becomes difficult to explain away. They describe a worldwide catastrophe, preceded by moral corruption or divine anger, survived by selected individuals who preserved knowledge, followed by those survivors teaching civilization to less advanced peoples. Geological evidence provides context. At the end of the last ice age, massive glaciers melted. Sea levels rose approximately 400 feet over several thousand years. This was not a single event, but a series of catastrophic rises. Coastal civilizations, if they existed, would have been destroyed. Their cities now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of conventional archaeology. The flood myths may preserve memory of these events, passed down through generations until they became the foundation stories of later cultures. Other universal mythological themes become less mysterious when viewed through this lens. Stories of gods or ancestors descending from the sky to teach primitive humans agriculture, writing, mathematics, and astronomy appear across cultures. Perhaps these describe survivors of a destroyed civilization encountering less advanced peoples and sharing their knowledge. The survivors would have seemed godlike, possessing capabilities the primitive cultures could not explain. Tales of flying machines appear in Indian texts, describing Vimanas with technical specifications for construction and operation. Ancient weapons in various mythologies produce effects resembling modern descriptions of advanced technology. Giants building megalithic structures may preserve memory, not of literal giants, but of a people who possessed engineering capabilities that seemed superhuman to those who came after. Specific myths encode verifiable information. Hindu astronomical texts describe Vega as the pole star, which was accurate 12,000 years ago due to Earth's precessional wobble, but hasn't been true since. Greek myths contain references to Mediterranean geography before certain islands and land bridges disappeared, preserving memory of landscapes that existed only in prehistoric times. Polynesian legends describe islands now submerged, and modern bathymetric surveys confirm islands existed in the locations described above water during lower sea level periods. The sophistication extends to how myths preserve information. Specific numbers recurring across stories, character types and plot structures that serve as mnemonic devices, narratives designed to be memorable to survive oral transmission across generations without writing. Australian Aboriginal traditions preserve accurate geographical information spanning over 10,000 years. Modern archaeological surveys validate what the stories describe: coastlines, river systems, landmarks that existed only during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. Certain myths encode technical knowledge. Alchemical texts describe chemical processes using allegorical language of dragons and transformation. Hero journeys embed astronomical cycles in the protagonist's travels. Creation stories encode geometric principles in descriptions of how the universe formed from chaos into order. This was not primitive ignorance. It was sophisticated encryption, knowledge disguised as story to survive when the civilization that created it did not. Ancient schools appear to have taught mythological interpretation, multiple levels of meaning accessible depending on the student's advancement. Casual listeners heard entertaining stories. Initiates extracted practical knowledge, learning to decode technical information embedded in narrative structures. Evidence suggests this was deliberate pedagogy, not modern reinterpretation, imposing meaning that was never intended. Modern analysis reveals what ancient listeners understood. Computer pattern recognition finds mathematical structures in mythological narratives. Archaeologists discover myths accurately describing landscapes thousands of years before the cultures preserving them existed. The stories were not fantasy. They were textbooks encoded for survival across catastrophic civilizations, collapses waiting for descendants sophisticated enough to read them correctly. What we dismissed as primitive superstition may represent the most successful knowledge preservation system ever created, more durable than libraries. more persistent than written records, stories that survived the fall of empires, the loss of languages, the forgetting of entire civilizations. And if we can learn to read them properly, they may reveal what those ancient peoples considered worth preserving, what knowledge they encoded into narratives specifically designed to outlast everything else they built. In the heart of Vatican City sits an archive containing approximately 35,000 volumes spanning 12 centuries of history. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known by a more revealing name, the Vatican Secret Archive. Most of what it contains has never been made public. Access is severely restricted. Even the scholars occasionally granted permission cannot browse the collection. They must request specific documents by name, which means you must already know what exists before you can ask to see it. The Vatican refuses to release a complete inventory. We do not know what we are not allowed to know. We can only piece together fragments from limited disclosures, from historical references, from the occasional document released for specific purposes. What we know is there comes from these fragments letters from Michelangelo, correspondence between popes and emperors, documentation of heresy trials, astronomical observations made by church astronomers dating back centuries, texts confiscated during the Inquisition, works seized from conquered territories, documents taken from suppressed religious movements whose versions of Christianity differed from what became orthodox. But historical records suggest far more. The Catholic Church spent centuries systematically collecting texts from across the known world. When territories were conquered, libraries were inventoried, and significant works were sent to Rome. When heresies were suppressed, their texts were confiscated. When ancient sites were excavated, discoveries were documented and stored. Many of these texts simply disappeared from public knowledge. We know certain documents existed because other sources referenced them. Roman texts describing the precise formula for Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that defended Constantinople, medical treatises from ancient scholars containing surgical techniques that would not be rediscovered for centuries, astronomical works from Babylonian and Egyptian sources that calculated celestial mechanics with impossible precision, texts from the Library of Alexandria that were copied before the fires, preserved by scholars who saw the destruction coming. The question is whether they survived, and if so, where they reside now. The most logical repository is the Vatican Archive, which has served as the Church's primary storage facility for sensitive materials for over 1,000 years. Occasionally, documents are released, sometimes by accident, sometimes for specific scholarly purposes, sometimes as diplomatic gestures. These glimpses reveal patterns, astronomical charts that demonstrate knowledge of planetary motion that should not have existed when they were created, medical texts describing treatments centuries ahead of their supposed time, historical accounts that contradict official narratives about the Church's actions during specific events. Each release raises questions about what remains sealed. If these documents were deemed appropriate for release, what standards govern what remains hidden? The official explanation is preservation. Old documents are fragile, light damages them, handling accelerates decay. Access must be limited to protect the materials for future generations, but the selectivity suggests other considerations. Certain categories of requests are consistently denied. Documents known to exist cannot be accessed. Historical accounts that would clarify controversial events remain unavailable. Scientific texts that would illuminate ancient knowledge stay sealed. The theory that emerges is that the archive contains more than historically sensitive information. It may house knowledge the Church deemed dangerous, natural philosophy that challenged religious explanations, pre-Christian historical accounts that undermined Church authority, technical information that could destabilize power structures if widely known. Recent limited access has produced discoveries that support this theory. Scholars examining permitted documents found evidence that the Church possessed advanced astronomical knowledge centuries before such understanding was supposedly achieved. Medical texts revealed treatments that were deliberately not shared, kept restricted while Church physicians used them privately. Historical documents proved the Church knew certain official narratives were false, but maintained them anyway. These discoveries raise the central question. If the archive contains evidence of knowledge deliberately suppressed, what else might be hidden in those 35,000 volumes? What ancient texts were preserved because the Church recognized their value but deemed them too dangerous for public access? What scientific understanding was restricted to maintain theological authority? And why, in an age of supposed transparency, does the Vatican continue refusing full access even to portions of the archive covering events from centuries past? The pattern of restriction suggests the archive's most significant contents are not historical curiosities, but active secrets. Knowledge that remains relevant, remains powerful, remains dangerous enough to justify continued concealment despite scholarly demands and public interest. The Vatican knows what it possesses. What we cannot determine is whether they know why their predecessors decided certain knowledge should be hidden, or whether they continue the tradition of restriction simply because it has always been so. Wealthy Romans maintained private libraries that rivaled modern research institutions. Cicero possessed thousands of scrolls collected from across the Mediterranean. Lucullus accumulated works from Greek, Egyptian, and Persian sources. These were not vanity collections displayed to impress guests. They were active research facilities where scholars studied texts unavailable to the public, where knowledge was analyzed, discussed, preserved. Roman writings contain references to texts describing advanced knowledge. Pliny mentions Egyptian treatises on transmutation of materials, chemical processes that produce specific effects. Engineering documents reference architectural techniques for constructing dome structures that conventional Roman methods could not achieve. Medical texts describe surgical procedures demonstrating anatomical understanding that should not have existed given the supposed limitations of their dissection practices. The question is not whether these texts existed. Roman sources cite them too specifically, too consistently. The question is what happened to them, and whether fragments survive. Rome approached knowledge acquisition systematically. When legions conquered territory, specific units were assigned to locate and secure libraries. Temple collections were inventoried. Significant texts were identified, confiscated, transported to Rome. Catalogues document this process. Lists of seized materials, records of translation projects converting Greek, Egyptian, and Persian texts into Latin. The establishment of imperial libraries across the empire to house and organize these collections. This was not random looting. It was deliberate accumulation of knowledge as a strategic resource. Rome understood that controlling information meant controlling power, and that the wisdom of conquered peoples could be exploited even when their armies could not. Some of this knowledge was preserved and eventually reached medieval monasteries, but vast amounts disappeared. When Rome fell, libraries burned, texts were destroyed, knowledge was lost, or so the conventional narrative suggests. Evidence points to something more deliberate. Certain Roman elite belonged to mystery schools, secret societies maintaining traditions inherited from Pythagoras and Plato, from Egyptian initiates and Greek philosophers. These schools studied knowledge not shared publicly. Archaeological evidence reveals private teaching facilities. References in Roman texts describe societies operating in secrecy, preserving wisdom considered too dangerous or too sacred for common access. These groups understood their civilization was fragile. They witnessed the gradual decline. They saw Christianity rising, saw the old ways being suppressed, and they took precautions. When Rome finally collapsed, there is clear evidence of deliberate preservation efforts. Texts sealed in waterproof containers and buried in specific locations. Libraries hidden in underground chambers designed to survive catastrophe. Information entrusted to specific monasteries with explicit instructions to maintain secrecy. This was not panicked evacuation. It was organized knowledge preservation by those who knew the empire was ending and were determined that certain information would survive. The barbarians who overran Rome were not randomly destroying culture. They specifically targeted pagan wisdom, medical knowledge, anything contradicting the emerging Christian orthodoxy. The Romans burying texts understood this. They were protecting knowledge from deliberate destruction, hiding it until a future time when it might be safe to recover. 1500 years later, that recovery continues. Archaeological excavations in Italy regularly discover sealed chambers, buried caches containing texts, Roman documents preserved in conditions suggesting intentional concealment rather than accidental loss. What is remarkable is how long these discoveries remain unpublicized. Excavations occur, chambers are opened, contents are catalogued. Then decades pass before any public announcement, if announcements occur at all. The pattern suggests that what is being found remains sensitive, that knowledge hidden in Rome's final days is being discovered and quietly suppressed again, this time by modern institutions with their own reasons for restricting access to what ancient Romans considered worth preserving at all costs. The template was established: knowledge collection, secret preservation, selective access. This pattern would survive Rome's fall, adapting to new circumstances, re-emerging in different forms, but maintaining the same essential structure, a division between those who know and those who do not, maintained across centuries and civilizations. The Silk Road was never just about silk. Merchants traveling between Rome and China carried more than spices and textiles. They carried ideas, mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, medical techniques, architectural innovations. The route functioned as a superhighway for knowledge transmission, connecting civilizations that official histories present as isolated and independent. Evidence reveals direct contact between scholars from distant cultures. Roman texts reference meetings with Indian mathematicians. Persian astronomical treatises incorporate Egyptian and Babylonian methods. Chinese philosophical works show awareness of Greek logical systems. These were not casual encounters. They represent deliberate intellectual exchange, scholars traveling vast distances specifically to study foreign knowledge and bring it home. Indian mathematical concepts reached the West along these routes. The concept of zero, which revolutionized calculation positional notation systems that made complex mathematics possible. Trigonometric methods that would not be independently developed in Europe for centuries. These moved westward through Persian intermediaries, translated and studied, eventually reaching Roman scholars who recognized their significance. Chinese metallurgical techniques influenced Roman steel production. Methods for creating alloys with specific properties, heat treatment processes that produced superior weapons and tools. Roman texts reference exotic Eastern methods for working metal, techniques that produced results their own smiths could not match. Persian astronomy served as a bridge, incorporating Babylonian precision with Egyptian geometrical methods, then transmitting this synthesis both east and west. The observatory at Gondishapur became a gathering place for scholars from multiple civilizations, a deliberate center for knowledge exchange where ideas flowed freely across cultural boundaries. The question is how much knowledge moved through these channels without being officially recorded. Merchants who could read carried texts alongside goods, selling manuscripts to collectors thousands of miles from their origins. Scholars traveled incognito, disguising their true purposes as they studied foreign techniques. Diplomatic missions included intellectual exchange that went unmentioned in political correspondence, but left traces in subsequent technological developments. Roman writings contain references to Eastern knowledge that suggest systematic collection efforts. Descriptions of Indian surgical techniques that surpassed Roman medical capabilities, accounts of Chinese engineering achievements that seemed impossible by Western standards, references to Persian chemical processes producing materials Rome could not replicate. When Rome fell, this accumulated Eastern knowledge did not disappear. It traveled east, back to the civilizations that originated it, where it would be preserved and expanded while Europe descended into centuries of intellectual stagnation. Baghdad became the inheritor of Roman learning. Islamic scholars collected texts fleeing the chaos of Rome's collapse. They translated Latin works into Arabic, studied them, improved upon them. Libraries in Damascus and Cordoba maintained knowledge that ceased to exist in its Latin original. Roman engineering treatises survived only in Arabic translation. Mathematical works that disappeared from Europe continued development in Persian versions. Medieval Europe forgot how to build roads, aqueducts, concrete structures. But in the East, scholars studied Roman engineering texts and advanced beyond them. They preserved medical knowledge that Europe lost. They maintained astronomical precision that the West would not recover for 1,000 years. When this knowledge eventually returned during the Renaissance, it sparked rapid advancement. But historians present this as European innovation, as the birth of modern science through European genius. They neglect to mention that much of it consisted of rediscovering what earlier civilizations knew and medieval Europe had forgotten. Greek fire's formula exists only in Arabic sources. Mathematical treatises attributed to Greek originators survive in Persian translations. medical procedures lost in the West continued evolving in Islamic hospitals. The scientific revolution was partially a recovery project, Europeans relearning from Eastern sources what their ancestors had possessed, then discarded. Modern archaeology continues revealing the extent of ancient exchange. Excavations in Central Asia uncover Roman coins buried with Chinese jade. Chemical analysis detects Mediterranean glass in Chinese tombs. Asian silk appears in Roman burial sites dating earlier than conventional trade chronologies suggest possible. Most intriguingly, textual analysis reveals similarities between Roman, Persian, and Indian sources that cannot be explained by independent development. Mathematical proofs, following identical logic. Medical procedures described in nearly identical terms. Astronomical methods using the same computational approaches. Either multiple cultures coincidentally developed identical sophisticated techniques, or knowledge sharing was far more extensive than historical records capture. The exchange was real, the network was vast, and the knowledge that flowed through it exceeded what survived in any single location, preserved in fragments across civilizations that maintained what Rome lost. The Forbidden City in Beijing is presented as a palace, the emperor's residence, a symbol of imperial power, but its primary function was something else entirely. It was the largest knowledge repository in the ancient world, a research facility where court scientists, astronomers, engineers, and physicians worked under conditions of absolute secrecy, protected and funded by imperial authority, forbidden on pain of death from sharing what they discovered with anyone outside the palace walls. Chinese technological achievements predate Western equivalents by centuries, sometimes by over a millennium. In the year 132, a Chinese inventor named Zhang Heng created a seismograph that could detect earthquakes occurring hundreds of miles away, indicating not just that a quake had happened, but the direction from which the seismic waves originated. Europe would not develop comparable technology for another 1700 years. Chinese astronomical instruments achieved accuracy, matching European precision centuries before the Renaissance. Observatories maintained continuous records spanning thousands of years, tracking celestial cycles with the kind of institutional commitment that required state support and protected succession of knowledge across generations. The observations were not casual, they were systematic, mathematical, precise. Chinese metallurgy produced steel of a quality Europe would not match until the Industrial Revolution. Analysis of ancient Chinese blades reveals microstructures and carbon content that modern metallurgists struggle to replicate using the techniques we believe were available. The steel was not merely functional. It was engineered at a level suggesting sophisticated understanding of material science, of how carbon content and heat treatment affect crystal structure and mechanical properties. The mystery is why these technologies remained restricted. Chinese emperors maintained deliberate technological monopolies. Knowledge was confined to imperial workshops. Unauthorized disclosure was punishable by execution, not just of the offender but often their entire family. This was not paranoid cruelty, it was strategic calculation. Technology meant power, and power required exclusive access. The true composition of certain Chinese steels remains unknown. Damascus-style blades produced in China used formulas that were never recorded publicly or were recorded in symbolic language we cannot decode. Gunpowder formulations existed in multiple variations, each producing different effects. But the simplified version that eventually reached Europe represented only the least sophisticated application of the technology. Chinese knowledge extended far beyond what standard histories acknowledge. Sophisticated understanding of magnetism enabled navigation using lodestones centuries before Europeans learned the technique. Advanced chemical processes created materials we cannot reproduce today, despite modern laboratory capabilities. Engineering methods for large-scale construction projects seem impossible given the tools we believe they possessed, yet the structures they built remain standing, their foundations more stable than modern equivalents. The imperial archives contained vast collections, technical manuals describing manufacturing processes, astronomical tables recording observations across millennia, texts claiming to preserve knowledge from earlier Chinese civilizations, dynasties that preceded recorded history, sources the Han and Tang emperors treated as ancient even by their standards. When dynasties fell, knowledge burned with them. Competing factions destroyed each other's libraries to eliminate rivals' legitimacy and consolidate control. The pattern repeated across Chinese history. Revolutionary governments systematically erasing what came before, ensuring certain knowledge could never be used to challenge their authority. What survives hints at what was lost. Texts describe devices that sound impossible. Accounts of inventions that appeared revolutionized some aspect of life, then disappeared and were not reinvented for centuries. Technical drawings showing mechanisms that modern engineers examine and struggle to understand how they functioned, let alone how they were manufactured with available tools. Chinese alchemy deserves particular attention. It was not primitive mysticism. It was sophisticated chemistry disguised in symbolic language, dragons and transformation, representing actual chemical processes, poetic metaphors encoding formulas for creating specific compounds and medicines. Modern researchers attempting to follow these recipes discover they work, that the symbolism conceals genuine pharmaceutical knowledge, that Chinese alchemists understood fundamental chemical principles and developed effective treatments that modern medicine is only now validating through clinical research. Portions of the Forbidden City's archives have never been fully catalogued. Imperial tombs remain sealed, their contents unknown, excavation prohibited due to stated concerns about preservation, but perhaps also about what might be revealed. Full disclosure of certain historical Chinese achievements would complicate modern narratives, revealing exchange with foreign cultures when isolationism serves political purposes, demonstrating sophistication that challenges assumptions about technological development being a uniquely Western achievement. The knowledge exists. Some of it survives in fragments. Much remains hidden deliberately or through neglect. And the pattern established in China, restrict, monopolize, execute those who share, represents one approach to the fundamental question every advanced civilization eventually faces. What happens when knowledge becomes too powerful to safely distribute? Sanskrit texts have been read as religious documents for centuries. Scholars study them for philosophical insight, for understanding ancient Hindu belief systems, for the spiritual wisdom they contain. But when you examine certain passages with technical rather than theological eyes, something unexpected emerges. These texts contain precise scientific information disguised as prayers to gods. The Rig Veda, composed over 3,000 years ago, consists of hymns dedicated to various deities. Read, literally they are poetic invocations. But when astronomers analyze the celestial descriptions embedded within these hymns, they find sophisticated astronomical observations, planetary positions, stellar movements, cycles that require long-term systematic observation to calculate. The poetry was the vehicle. The astronomy was the cargo. The Mahabharata describes weapons that sound like mythology until you compare the effects to modern technology. Projectiles that produce blindness and burns across vast areas, descriptions matching thermal and radiation effects. Vehicles called Vimanas with technical specifications for construction, dimensions, materials, propulsion methods. These read like mythology until engineers attempt to interpret them technically, at which point they begin resembling engineering manuals written in poetic metaphor. Medical texts like the Sushruta Samhita contain surgical procedures that would not be matched in the West until the 20th century. Detailed descriptions of plastic surgery techniques, cataract removal, wound treatment with antiseptic protocols. The text describes over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical instruments. It demonstrates understanding of human anatomy that requires dissection, yet official histories claim cultural prohibitions prevented such practices. The encoding was necessary for preservation. In a culture emphasizing oral transmission, embedding technical knowledge in memorable religious narratives ensured survival across generations. When practical application was forgotten, the texts remained sacred, copied and memorized by priests who maintained them even without understanding their full significance. The spiritual framework protected technical information from complete loss during periods when civilization declined. Ayurvedic texts describe anatomical details visible only through dissection. Astronomical treatises calculate planetary movements with precision matching modern computer models. Mathematical works contain concepts like infinity, zero, and negative numbers that would not appear in Western mathematics for over 1,000 years. This was not primitive guesswork. It was sophisticated knowledge deliberately embedded in religious context. Sanskrit itself functioned as code. The language was designed for precision, capable of describing complex technical processes without ambiguity. Certain passages make little sense spiritually but become clear when read as technical instructions. The grammar allows multiple valid interpretations depending on context, enabling texts to serve dual purposes: spiritual teaching for general audiences, technical manual for initiated students. Modern researchers attempting to decode these texts produce surprising results. Engineers building devices based on ancient Vimana descriptions discover aerodynamic principles. Chemists following recipes from alchemical texts create compounds whose properties match what the texts promised. Architects analyzing temple construction find acoustic and geometric principles, serving specific technical functions beyond aesthetic or religious purposes. If ancient Indians possessed such knowledge, why did it decline? The answer appears to lie in how it was transmitted. Knowledge passed from teacher to student through initiation, with interpretive keys taught orally, never written down. When invasions, social upheaval, and cultural disruption broke these teaching lineages, the keys were lost. The texts survived because they were sacred, but their technical meaning became inaccessible. Some lineages maintained continuity. Certain yoga traditions preserve sophisticated understanding of human physiology, techniques producing measurable effects that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to explain. Temple architect families maintain building techniques passed through apprenticeship across centuries. Ayurvedic physicians use treatments whose mechanisms remained mysterious until recent biochemical research validated ancient formulations. The Delhi Iron Pillar stands in New Delhi, 1600 years old, exposed to monsoons and humidity, yet showing no rust. Modern metallurgists examining it discover techniques described in ancient Sanskrit texts on metallurgy, processes that modern materials science has only recently confirmed as effective. The knowledge was there, encoded in religious and technical texts, waiting for readers who could understand what they were seeing. Much remains undecoded. Texts exist that have been read religiously for millennia, but never interpreted technically. The recognition that these documents might contain practical knowledge is recent. The tools for proper analysis are still being developed. What else might be hidden in plain sight, preserved in prayers that are actually formulas, in myths that are actually manuals? Tibet existed for centuries in a state of deliberate isolation. Mountains provided natural barriers, political independence was fiercely maintained, and within that isolation, a culture developed that was obsessed with preserving knowledge. Not just spiritual teachings, but the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that preceded them. Monasteries functioned as universities. Monks memorized entire texts to protect against loss. Manuscripts were copied with meticulous care, generation after generation, maintaining accuracy across centuries. What they preserved represents perhaps the most intact ancient knowledge traditions still surviving. Complete collections of Buddhist texts that were lost in India after Islamic invasions destroyed the original sources. Tantric writings containing encoded information about medicine, chemistry, human physiology. Indigenous Tibetan traditions of healing and astronomy that trace back before Buddhism reached the region. Knowledge from sources we can no longer identify. Tibetan medical texts describe treatments that modern pharmaceutical research is validating. Compounds derived from high-altitude plants, combinations of minerals and herbs that produce specific therapeutic effects. The texts were not guessing. They documented empirical knowledge accumulated through systematic experimentation and observations spanning centuries. Astronomical calculations maintained through continuous observation demonstrate precision that should not have been possible without instruments. Yet Tibetan astronomers tracked celestial cycles, predicted eclipses, mapped stellar movements using naked eye observation combined with mathematical methods inherited from Indian sources and refined through their own traditions. Then there are the physiological techniques. Tibetan monks demonstrating control over supposedly involuntary processes, raising body temperature in freezing conditions through meditation alone, slowing heart rate and metabolism to levels Western medicine claimed impossible. When researchers finally tested these claims under laboratory conditions, they found them accurate. Tibetan practitioners could do things that contradicted established understanding of human physiology. The techniques produce measurable brain changes. Meditation practices that alter neural structure, that enhance cognitive function, that produce psychological effects modern therapy is attempting to replicate. Tibetan traditions preserved sophisticated understanding of the relationship between mind and body, between consciousness and physical processes, knowledge that Western science is only beginning to validate. What remains hidden within Tibetan traditions is impossible to fully determine. Texts exist that have never been completely translated. Practices are taught only to initiated students after years of preparation. Knowledge was deliberately obscured even within the tradition, protected from misuse by restriction and encryption. Certain teachings were never written down, passed directly from teacher to student through oral transmission. Human memory chains spanning centuries ensuring preservation while maintaining secrecy. Then came the invasion. Chinese forces systematically destroyed monasteries. Texts were burned. Practitioners were killed or scattered. What happened in Tibet during the mid-20th century represents the single largest destruction of ancient knowledge in modern times. Not gradual loss through neglect, but deliberate, comprehensive elimination of an entire knowledge preservation system. Tibetan scholars in exile raced to save what remains, collecting surviving manuscripts, digitizing fragile texts before they deteriorate beyond recovery. Interviewing elderly practitioners who carry knowledge only in memory, traditions never written down, techniques that will disappear when they die. It is a race against time, and time is winning. What was lost we will never fully know. Texts describing techniques that no longer exist anywhere, teaching lineages broken permanently. Knowledge that survived centuries of careful preservation eliminated within a single generation. The tragedy is not abstract history. It is happening now, within living memory, ancient wisdom disappearing as the last keepers age and die without successors. What survives reveals what was lost. Medical formulas that modern chemistry confirms are effective, preserved in fragments. Psychological techniques matching cutting-edge therapeutic approaches, maintained by scattered practitioners. Evidence that Tibetan traditions preserved knowledge from sources far older than Buddhism itself, possibly including Indian traditions that vanished from India but survived in Tibetan preservation. Previously unknown texts continue appearing in hidden monastery libraries. Practices once secret are being taught publicly as exiled communities realize restriction no longer serves its original protective purpose. The recognition grows that Tibetan traditions represent our best surviving example of ancient knowledge systems that were once global, that existed across civilizations, that have otherwise been lost or so fragmented we cannot reconstruct them. What Tibet preserved through isolation and institutional dedication offers a glimpse of what humanity once possessed and largely lost. The knowledge was real, the preservation was successful, until it was deliberately destroyed. There is a bias embedded in how we discuss the Americas before Columbus. The language itself reveals it, pre-Columbian, as if meaningful history only begins when Europeans arrive, as if the civilizations that existed for millennia before contact were merely prologue to the real story. This framing has consequences. It makes us dismiss evidence that contradicts our assumptions about primitive New World cultures. The Maya calculated planetary positions with accuracy that would not be matched in Europe until after the invention of the telescope. They tracked Venus with precision measured in hours over observational periods, spanning 5,000 years. They did this using naked eye observation, mathematical systems they developed independently, and a dedication to astronomical record, keeping that exceeded anything in medieval Europe. When astronomers finally analyzed surviving Mayan astronomical tables, they found calculations accurate to within seconds of modern measurements. The Inca moved stones weighing hundreds of tons up mountain slopes, then fitted them together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. No mortar binds these blocks, precision alone holds them in place. Modern engineers examining these structures struggle to explain how such accuracy was achieved. Attempts to replicate Incan stonework using period-appropriate tools consistently fail to match the precision visible in walls that have stood for centuries. The Mayan long count calendar tracks time over millions of years. The mathematical sophistication required to conceive and implement such a system demonstrates understanding far beyond simple day counting for agricultural purposes. This was a culture that thought in terms of vast temporal cycles, that developed mathematical concepts including zero independently of old-world civilizations, that embedded astronomical knowledge into calendrical systems of remarkable complexity. Aztec botanical knowledge surpassed European equivalents in many areas. Their physicians understood properties of hundreds of medicinal plants. Their agricultural techniques supported population densities that European farming methods could not match. The Chinampas, floating gardens, represent sophisticated hydraulic engineering, creating productive farmland from swamps and lakes. This was not primitive subsistence agriculture. It was advanced resource management supporting complex urban civilizations. These achievements were not isolated moments of brilliance. Evidence suggests knowledge traditions spanning millennia. Sites like Carroll in Peru date back 5,000 years, showing urban planning and monumental architecture that predates Egyptian pyramids. Pre-Olmec settlements demonstrate sophisticated understanding long before the cultures we recognize as major civilizations. Mississippian earthwork structures incorporate astronomical alignments and geometric principles, requiring extensive observational knowledge and mathematical calculation. Then the Spanish arrived. Conquistadors systematically burned Maya codices, thousands of books containing astronomical observations, historical records, medical knowledge, cultural wisdom. Bishop Diego de Landa described burning them in piles, destroying in hours what had taken centuries to accumulate. 4 codices survived, 4 books from a civilization that possessed vast libraries. The rest became ash. Disease killed populations that maintained oral traditions. Displacement destroyed teaching lineages. Specialist knowledge holders, astronomers, physicians, engineers were eliminated or scattered. What survived did so, despite deliberate destruction, preserved by indigenous communities who maintained traditions underground, who hid what they could, who passed knowledge through generations, despite systematic attempts at cultural erasure. Mainstream archaeology has been slow to acknowledge pre-Columbian sophistication. Dating that pushes civilizations back beyond accepted chronology gets dismissed. Artifacts suggesting transoceanic contact disappear into storage. Indigenous oral histories describing ancient techniques and knowledge are treated as myth until archaeological evidence forces reconsideration. Recent technology is changing this. LiDAR penetrates jungle canopy, revealing massive urban centers that were always there, but invisible from ground level. Chemical analysis proves sophisticated metallurgy and materials science. New dating techniques push American civilization back thousands of years beyond previous estimates. The Amazon itself may be largely artificial. What appears as pristine rainforest shows evidence of massive human engineering. Terra preta, enriched soil that remains fertile centuries after creation, covers vast areas. Forest composition suggests deliberate management as agricultural systems. Cities existed beneath the canopy, supporting populations that managed the forest as carefully as any agricultural field. Pre-Columbian societies shaped entire ecosystems at continental scale. The sophistication was real. The knowledge was extensive, and most of it was deliberately destroyed or lost through the catastrophe of contact. What remains are fragments, enough to demonstrate capability, insufficient to fully understand scope. The Olmec civilization is called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They appear in the archaeological record around 3,000 years ago, and with them comes something unusual. They are already sophisticated, already possess mathematical knowledge, already understand astronomical cycles, already create monumental architecture with precision that should require centuries of development. Yet we find no evidence of that development. They seem to arrive fully formed, as if inheriting capabilities rather than inventing them. Their most famous artifacts are massive stone heads, some weighing over 20 tons, carved with precision that suggests advanced tools or techniques we do not associate with their era. The faces depicted have sparked decades of uncomfortable debate. Some show features that appear African, others seem Asian. This should not be possible if the Americas were isolated, populated only through Bering Strait migrations. Yet the stone heads exist, their features undeniable, their implications unwelcome. The Olmecs developed, or perhaps inherited, the long count calendar that the Maya would later adopt. They created precise stone sculptures using supposedly primitive tools. They established trade networks spanning thousands of miles, moving massive stones across difficult terrain, organizing labor and resources at scales that require sophisticated administration. Before the Olmecs, evidence of sophistication appears in forms we are only now recognizing. Aguada Phoenix, recently discovered through LiDAR, reveals massive earthwork construction dating to 1000 BCE or earlier. The organized labor required, the planning, the mathematical understanding of geometry. These should not exist in societies we classify as primitive or early stage. Certain Olmec artifacts contain what appear to be writing systems, predating the conventionally accepted development of American scripts. Mathematical sophistication appears in their alignments and proportions beyond what we attribute to their era. The question persists: where did this knowledge originate? Indigenous traditions provide an answer that archaeology has largely ignored. They describe older societies, cultures possessing great knowledge that existed before the Olmecs. Geological evidence suggests coastal civilizations may have flourished during lower sea levels, then been destroyed when glaciers melted and oceans rose. Those coastal settlements now lie underwater, inaccessible to conventional excavation, their sophistication unknown because we cannot study what we cannot reach. Certain archaeological sites show something paradoxical. Multiple construction phases where the oldest work is the most precise, the most sophisticated. Later additions are cruder, less exact. This pattern inverts our expectations. Civilizations should improve their techniques over time, not decline. Yet repeatedly, we find ancient foundations demonstrating capabilities that later builders could not match. Evidence of early American sophistication continues emerging despite resistance. Copper working in North America dates to 5000 BCE, showing metallurgical understanding far earlier than conventional timelines suggested possible. Clovis points demonstrate tool, making precision that challenges assumptions about primitive early Americans. Earthwork structures incorporate astronomical alignments requiring long-term observation and mathematical calculation to design. The peopling of the Americas itself is being reconsidered. New genetic evidence suggests multiple migrations from different source populations. Coastal routes that would have been viable during lower sea levels but are now submerged. The controversial possibility that transoceanic contact occurred from both Asia and Africa in prehistoric times, that the Bering Strait land bridge was not the only entry point. Artifacts showing symbolic systems predating accepted chronologies exist, but remain controversial. Dating that challenges the Clovis first model gets disputed. Indigenous oral traditions describing occupations spanning far longer than archaeology previously accepted are being validated by discoveries that keep pushing back the timeline. What was dismissed as myth increasingly proves to be memory. The Olmecs built cities and carved stone with precision we struggle to explain. Their own traditions, like those of so many ancient cultures, speak of inheriting knowledge from those who came before. They did not claim to be the beginning. They acknowledged predecessors, sources of wisdom now lost to us. If the Olmecs inherited their sophistication, the source must have been remarkable. Yet we have found almost nothing of that source. Either it was destroyed by natural catastrophe, lies beneath risen seas, or exists in evidence we have systematically ignored because it contradicts our comfortable chronologies about human development in the Americas. The mystery remains, the questions persist. And each new discovery suggests the answers, when they finally come, will require revising more than just dates. Egyptian mummies from the New Kingdom period, housed in museums across Europe, have been subjected to modern chemical analysis. The results created a problem that Egyptologists still struggle to address. The mummified remains contain traces of cocaine and nicotine. These compounds come from plants, coca and tobacco, that are native exclusively to the Americas. They did not exist in the Old World before Columbus. Yet the compounds are present in mummies that predate Columbus by 3,000 years. The standard responses are inadequate. Contamination is suggested, but the substances appear in internal tissues, not just external surfaces. Modern introduction seems implausible given the secure contexts and controlled analysis. The alternative explanation, that these plants somehow crossed the Atlantic before the Columbian Exchange, contradicts fundamental assumptions about ancient isolation between Old and New Worlds. This is not the only evidence suggesting pre-Columbian trans-oceanic contact. Viking settlements in Newfoundland are now accepted as fact, pushing European presence in America back centuries before Columbus. Polynesian contact with South America has been confirmed through chicken DNA analysis and the distribution of sweet potatoes, which are American in origin yet appear in Pacific Islands before any documented European transfer. More controversial possibilities involve Phoenician, African, and Asian contact. The evidence exists but remains disputed. Inscriptions in various American locations that some researchers interpret as ancient Phoenician, Hebrew, or Libyan scripts. Artifacts displaying Old World characteristics found in New World contexts where they should not exist. Botanical evidence suggesting various plant species crossed oceans through human agency long before the accepted timeline permits. The controversy around this topic is not merely academic. Accepting pre-Columbian contact challenges narratives about indigenous development. It raises questions about how much knowledge was transmitted versus independently developed. It threatens scholarly reputations built on isolation models that have dominated archaeology for generations. And it complicates comfortable stories about European discovery and the uniqueness of Columbus's achievement. Pyramids appear in Egypt and Central America. The structural similarities are remarkable. Step pyramids with similar proportions, astronomical alignments built into their orientations, mathematical relationships embedded in their dimensions. Independent development is the conventional explanation, but the specific similarities accumulate beyond what coincidence easily explains. Polynesian-style stonework appears on South American coasts, precise fitting without mortar, techniques that match Pacific Island construction methods. Ancient maritime capabilities were far more advanced than conventional history acknowledges. Ships from ancient periods were ocean-worthy. Knowledge of currents and wind patterns enabled long-distance voyages. Modern sailors using reconstructed ancient vessels have successfully crossed oceans, demonstrating that the technology was adequate. The question is not whether ancient peoples could have made these journeys, but whether they did. Evidence gets suppressed or reinterpreted. Artifacts that challenge chronology disappear into museum storage, inaccessible to independent verification. Sites with controversial implications remain unexcavated despite obvious archaeological significance. Carbon dating results that contradict expectations are dismissed as contaminated rather than considered as challenges to the prevailing model. Researchers pursuing these questions report funding difficulties and professional consequences. The theory emerges that transoceanic navigation knowledge was deliberately restricted. Ancient maritime cultures maintained trade secrets. Navigator guilds preserved knowledge of favorable routes and seasonal patterns. Later powers systematically suppressed this information to control ocean trade and maintain monopolies. The knowledge did not disappear naturally. It was hidden, restricted, eliminated. If transoceanic contact existed, implications cascade. Similarities in architecture and astronomy might reflect actual knowledge transmission. The sophistication of ancient navigation requires dramatic upward revision. Ancient civilizations were more connected, more mobile, more capable of sharing information across vast distances than we have been willing to acknowledge. Acceptance is growing, not because evidence is new, but because younger scholars are less invested in defending outdated models. Technological advances make suppressed evidence harder to ignore. Genetic studies force recognition of multiple migration routes into the Americas. Chemical analysis proves plant movement before Columbus. The old certainties are crumbling. The isolation model is failing. What remains is a question. If ancient peoples crossed oceans, shared knowledge, connected civilizations across continents, who benefited from hiding this history? And what else might be hidden about the true scope of ancient human achievement and connection? When the temples burned and the empires collapsed, the keepers of knowledge faced a choice. They could allow what they preserved to die with the civilizations that protected them, or they could adapt, find new structures, new ways to maintain traditions that stretched back to sources they themselves no longer fully understood. They chose adaptation. And in that choice, ancient wisdom found unlikely vessels for survival. Medieval craft guilds appeared throughout Europe as Christianity consolidated power and the old ways were systematically suppressed. On the surface, these were professional associations. Stonemasons organizing for economic advantage, metallurgists protecting trade secrets, physicians maintaining standards of practice. but beneath that practical exterior, something else operated. A system of knowledge transmission that traced its lineage back through Rome, through Greece, through Egypt, to sources that existed before writing itself. The stonemasons who built Gothic cathedrals possessed geometric and engineering knowledge that enabled architectural achievements matching ancient capabilities. They understood force distribution, load bearing, the mathematics of arches and vaults. When you examine their work, you find techniques that appear in ancient structures, methods that conventional history claims were lost and had to be rediscovered, except the masons never lost them. They maintained the knowledge through apprenticeship systems, passing it directly from master to student, preserving capabilities across centuries when official learning had collapsed. Metallurgical guilds created Damascus steel and sophisticated alloys using processes that modern materials science struggles to replicate fully. They possessed understanding of heat treatment, carbon content, crystal structure that would not be officially explained until modern chemistry emerged, yet they could produce the results consistently, generation after generation, through techniques handed down as craft mysteries rather than scientific principles. Medical guilds preserved surgical techniques and treatments that would not be officially discovered for centuries. They maintained knowledge quietly, treating patients effectively, while the theoretical understanding that would eventually explain why their methods worked remained centuries in the future. The knowledge functioned even when the science behind it was forgotten. These guilds saw themselves as preserving ancient wisdom. Masonic traditions explicitly claimed descent from the builders of Solomon's temple. Alchemical texts referenced Egyptian and Babylonian sources. Guild rituals incorporated elements that trace back to ancient mystery schools, initiation ceremonies, oaths of secrecy, symbolic teaching methods that match what we find in descriptions of ancient priesthoods. Secrecy was necessary for multiple reasons. Technical knowledge provided economic advantage. Guild monopolies depended on restricting information. Certain knowledge was considered heretical by the church, and sharing it meant death. But there was also genuine belief that some knowledge was dangerous, that certain capabilities should not be freely distributed, that wisdom required worthiness. When Christianity suppressed pagan practices, the keepers adapted by embedding their traditions within Christian acceptable frameworks. Cathedral construction became the vehicle for preserving sacred geometry. Alchemical symbolism incorporated Christian imagery. Guild structures mimicked monastic orders. The knowledge survived by appearing orthodox while maintaining heterodox content beneath the surface. The result was peculiar. Technical capabilities were preserved continuously from ancient times through medieval guilds to modern practices, but theoretical understanding was often lost. Guilds could do things they could not fully explain. They knew what worked without always knowing why. The practice outlasted the principle. Evidence of deliberate encoding appears throughout guild traditions. Symbols and rituals containing technical information disguised as spiritual teaching. Architectural features in medieval buildings encoding mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The practice of hiding wisdom in plain sight through symbolic representation that required initiation to decode properly. This system gradually broke down. The Enlightenment emphasized open publication. The Industrial Revolution created new technical education systems that did not require guild membership. Secret societies transformed into professional associations that published their knowledge rather than restricting it. The practical advantages of secrecy diminished as technology advanced and information became more valuable when shared than when hoarded. But traces persisted. Certain guilds maintained secrecy well into the modern era. Some knowledge was never fully published, remaining in private collections or restricted archives. Networks of initiated individuals continued passing down traditions even as formal guild structures dissolved. The provocative question is whether any of these networks still exist, whether certain technical capabilities remain deliberately restricted, not for economic advantage, but because full disclosure would reveal the extent of ancient knowledge that was preserved through these underground channels. Whether medieval guilds were merely the middle chapter in a story of knowledge transmission that begins in ancient temples and continues in altered forms into the present day. Alchemy has been misunderstood for centuries, dismissed as the deluded quest to turn lead into gold. This mischaracterization obscures what alchemy actually was: a comprehensive natural philosophy studying matter, transformation, and the underlying principles of physical and spiritual reality. The gold was metaphor more often than gold. The real work was understanding how substances change, how nature operates, how knowledge itself transforms both matter and mind. The theoretical foundation came from Hermetic texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, a figure blending Greek and Egyptian wisdom traditions. These writings contain sophisticated concepts about matter, consciousness, and cosmos that would influence the development of early modern science, even as they were officially dismissed as occult nonsense. The dismissal served a purpose. It allowed dangerous ideas to circulate disguised as mysticism, protected from persecution by their apparent absurdity. Embedded within alchemical texts are descriptions of real chemical processes, instructions for creating acids that dissolve specific materials, formulas for alloys with particular properties, pharmaceutical recipes for medicines that modern chemistry confirms are effective. Strip away the symbolic language about dragons and spiritual purification, and you find practical chemistry, workable procedures, genuine knowledge encoded in metaphor. The symbols themselves trace back to ancient sources. Alchemical notation resembles Egyptian hieroglyphs used in chemical contexts. Processes described in medieval alchemical manuscripts match methods from ancient texts. The alchemists themselves insisted they were not inventing but recovering, that their wisdom came from Egypt, from Babylon, from sources that predated their own era by millennia. The symbolic language served multiple purposes. Partly it maintained secrecy and guild privilege. Partly it compensated for the lack of chemical terminology that would only emerge later. But alchemists also believed their work operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical transformation of substances, psychological transformation of the practitioner, spiritual understanding of natural principles. The symbols captured all levels at once, encoding practical chemistry within frameworks of meaning that addressed human consciousness as well as material properties. Modern research validates this multi-layered approach. When alchemical texts are read literally as chemistry instructions, stripping away metaphor, many describe processes that work. When analyzed psychologically, they map onto theories of consciousness and personal development that modern psychology is only now articulating clearly. When examined philosophically, they contain sophisticated epistemology that influenced thinkers who shaped modern scientific method. The connection between alchemy and early science is closer than official histories acknowledge. Isaac Newton devoted more time to alchemical research than to the physics that made him famous. His private papers, decoded only recently, reveal calculations mixing physics and alchemy, apocalyptic predictions based on formulas he never published. Robert Boyle, considered a founder of modern chemistry, was a practicing alchemist who believed he was recovering ancient wisdom rather than creating new science. The scientific revolution did not emerge purely from rational philosophy. It grew from alchemical traditions that preserved experimental and empirical investigation through centuries when theological speculation dominated intellectual life. Alchemy provided cover for naturalistic investigation of phenomena the Church found problematic. By disguising chemistry as mysticism, alchemists maintained research traditions that would eventually transform into modern science. The decline came gradually. Emphasis on quantification and measurement led to modern chemistry's more restricted focus. Symbolic language came to seem primitive. History was rewritten to present science as emerging from rationality rather than from encoded ancient knowledge, a reframing that served the Enlightenment's self-image while obscuring actual historical development. But alchemical traditions never completely disappeared. Certain organizations maintained practices into the modern era. Some chemical processes described in alchemical texts remain incompletely understood or replicated. Recent interest in consciousness studies and holistic approaches has prompted reconsideration of alchemical theories previously dismissed. Modern discoveries provide unexpected validation. Quantum mechanics reveals that observer consciousness affects physical measurement, a principle alchemists insisted upon for centuries. Psychological research confirms alchemical theories about symbolism and transformation. Materials science discovers that certain ancient alloys possess properties that shouldn't exist given supposed manufacturing limitations, properties potentially explainable through alchemical processes we dismissed as impossible. The question becomes whether alchemy was pseudoscience, or whether our categories are inadequate. Whether knowledge encoded in symbol and metaphor might preserve understanding that purely literal, reductionist approaches cannot capture. Whether the alchemists, in their peculiar way, understood something about the relationship between consciousness and matter that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. In the early 17th century, mysterious documents began circulating through Europe. Manifestos claiming that a secret brotherhood existed, possessing ancient wisdom, preparing to reform human knowledge. They called themselves Rosicrucians. No one could find them, no one could verify their existence. Yet the manifestos sparked intense interest among Europe's intellectual elite, triggering responses, debates, searches for the invisible college that might or might not be real. Whether the Rosicrucians existed as an actual organization or represented an elaborate literary movement remains unclear. What matters more is the effect. The ideas they promoted, synthesizing alchemical, hermetic, and Kabbalistic traditions, influenced how early modern thinkers approached natural philosophy. Francis Bacon's scientific method incorporated Rosicrucian principles about discovering nature's hidden laws. The Royal Society, founded to advance scientific knowledge, included members with documented Rosicrucian interests. The scientific revolution's emphasis on uncovering universal principles reflected Hermetic thinking more than purely rational materialism. Freemasonry presents clearer historical documentation. It emerged from actual medieval stonemason guilds, adopting their symbolic systems and organizational structures while transitioning from operative craft to speculative philosophy. The transition occurred gradually during the 17th and 18th centuries as lodges began accepting members who were not working masons but intellectuals, merchants, political leaders drawn to masonry as a vehicle for Enlightenment ideals. The mythology around masonry exceeds the verified history. Claims of descent from Solomon's temple builders, from Egyptian priesthoods, from ancient mystery schools. These are largely invention or wishful connection making, but something real existed beneath the exaggerated claims. Masonic lodges preserved geometric and architectural knowledge from guild traditions. They maintained symbolic systems combining Christian, alchemical, and classical elements. And most importantly, they created networks connecting intellectuals across Europe who shared interests in natural philosophy, political reform, and the preservation of knowledge they believed was being suppressed. The influence on modern history is documented. Masonic networks facilitated information exchange among early scientists who might otherwise have remained isolated. Masonic principles emphasizing reason, virtue, and natural law influenced Enlightenment political thought. The American founding documents reflect Masonic ideals explicitly, and many founding fathers were lodge members who encoded Masonic symbolism into Washington, D.C.'s layout. Symbols that, stripped of their Masonic associations, trace back to ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek sources. The question of what knowledge these societies actually possessed beyond public teachings remains mysterious. References in Masonic rituals to preserving ancient wisdom, claims of inner teachings available only to advanced initiates. The persistent tradition that symbolic presentations contain literal information for those with proper interpretive keys. These claims remain unverified, but also unrefuted, creating space for legitimate questions about restricted knowledge. Other secret societies operated during the same period. The Illuminati existed briefly in late 18th century Bavaria, a real organization promoting Enlightenment rationalism, far less influential than mythology suggests, suppressed quickly by authorities who found its political ideals threatening. Hermetic orders claimed ancient Egyptian lineage and attracted serious scholars alongside cranks. Kabbalistic societies preserved Jewish mystical traditions that encoded philosophical and mathematical knowledge in symbolic frameworks. What these societies actually represented becomes clearer when you strip away mythology. They were networks enabling intellectual exchange when open discussion was dangerous, vehicles for preserving alternative religious and philosophical traditions. Attempts to systematize knowledge from various ancient sources into coherent teaching frameworks. Their importance lies less in secret knowledge they possessed than in the knowledge networks they created. The influence on modernity is undeniable. Masonic principles shaped democratic political thought in ways still visible in Western governance structures. Alchemical and hermetic ideas influenced psychology's development, holistic approaches to science, and cultural understanding of transformation and development. The ideal of secret societies preserving ancient wisdom became a powerful archetype shaping how we think about knowledge, power, and hidden truth. Many of these organizations still exist. Their influence has waned, but their archives and libraries contain texts and traditions that mainstream scholarship hasn't fully examined. Certain knowledge claims they make remain unresolved, neither verified nor definitively refuted. The question persists whether they preserved genuine fragments of ancient knowledge or merely maintained traditions that claim such preservation without substance. The truth likely lies between extremes. These societies were not repositories of world-changing secrets, but neither were they mere social clubs with pretentious rituals. They represented the continuation of knowledge, keeping traditions adapting to modern circumstances, maintaining networks and practices that trace back through medieval guilds to ancient temples, preserving what they could of wisdom that predated them by millennia. Most archaeological research is conducted ethically, openly, with genuine commitment to discovering truth. Scholars dedicate careers to expanding human knowledge, publishing findings regardless of whether they confirm or challenge expectations. This is important to acknowledge before examining the exceptions. Because the exceptions exist, documented cases where evidence has been suppressed, where findings have been dismissed without proper investigation, where access to sites and materials has been restricted for reasons having nothing to do with scientific caution, the suppression is often structural rather than conspiratorial. Academic careers depend on publishing within accepted frameworks. Researchers who challenge consensus find funding harder to secure, positions harder to maintain. Journals hesitate to publish findings that contradict established models. Peer reviewers, themselves invested in conventional understanding, apply stricter standards to evidence that would require revising their own life's work. The system protects itself without anyone necessarily intending suppression, yet suppression occurs. The Shroud of Turin sat in ecclesiastical custody for decades while scientists requested permission for radiocarbon dating. The technology existed, the interest was widespread, yet access was repeatedly denied, creating space for speculation that careful testing could have resolved. When testing finally occurred, the methodology faced criticism regardless of results, demonstrating how controversial subjects attract skepticism that cleaner scientific questions avoid. Dead Sea Scroll fragments remained inaccessible to independent researchers for decades after discovery. A small group controlled access, delaying publication, fueling speculation about contents too sensitive or challenging to reveal. When broader access finally came, the texts proved important but not earth-shattering. The restriction created mystery where transparency might have prevented it, but the pattern was established. Significant findings could be bottlenecked by small groups controlling access. Evidence pushing back dates for human presence in the Americas faced persistent resistance, despite mounting support. Sites showing habitation 15,000 years ago or earlier challenged the Clovis first model that dominated American archaeology. Rather than investigating anomalies, many archaeologists dismissed them as contaminated, misdated, misinterpreted. The paradigm was protected. When enough evidence accumulated to force revision, acceptance came grudgingly, and researchers who had advocated earlier dates found their careers had suffered for being correct too soon. This is paradigm protection. Established theories become entrenched. Evidence contrary to accepted models faces higher standards than evidence supporting them. The principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence becomes a mechanism for dismissing rather than investigating. Continental drift was rejected for decades, despite compelling evidence. Meteorite impacts were dismissed as impossible until craters became undeniable. The pattern repeats. Legitimate discoveries face resistance because they challenge comfortable understanding. Some restrictions appear deliberately rather than cautiously applied. Excavation permits denied without clear justification. Findings mentioned in preliminary reports then never fully published. Artifacts disappearing into museum storage, becoming inaccessible, even to credentialed researchers requesting access. The politics of archaeology matters. National narratives influence what gets excavated, what gets publicized. Politically sensitive findings may be suppressed to avoid complications. International tensions affect site access and material sharing. Controlled disclosure occurs, Information about controversial findings is released gradually, testing reaction before committing to full publication. This can result in legitimate discoveries being delayed or never completely revealed. The intention might be caution, but the effect is suppression. Peer review, essential for quality control, can also suppress innovation. Papers are rejected not for methodological flaws but for challenging reviewers' worldviews. Researchers receive advice to tone down conclusions to increase publication chances. The requirement to publish in prestigious journals gives small groups significant power over what enters the scientific record. Some findings are ignored rather than refuted, creating suppression through silence rather than through active opposition. The digital age complicates this. Open access publishing democratizes knowledge dissemination, but established institutions still control access to sites and materials. Social media allows direct communication with the public, bypassing gatekeepers but also bypassing quality control. Crowdfunding enables unconventional research but also facilitates pseudoscience. The fundamental tension remains between open inquiry and quality control, between innovation and verification, between new evidence and established understanding. The archaeologist whose carbon dating pushed American habitation back 15,000 years couldn't find journals willing to publish results that challenged conventional chronology. Eventually, he posted findings online, letting evidence speak without institutional blessing. This is the modern dilemma. Gatekeeping serves purposes, maintaining standards, preventing bad science from spreading, but it also suppresses good science that arrives at inconvenient conclusions. Mount Ararat sits on Turkey's border with Armenia, a strategic military zone where access has been restricted for decades. Numerous anomalies detected through aerial surveys and satellite imagery have sparked interest among archaeologists and researchers, yet permission to conduct thorough ground surveys is consistently denied. The official explanation involves military security and border sensitivity. The effect is that questions about what might exist on the mountain remain unanswered. Investigation blocked not by scientific concerns but by political and strategic considerations. Egyptian authorities control access to archaeological sites with restrictions that sometimes appear to serve purposes beyond preservation. Certain chambers in pyramids remain unopened. Excavation permits for specific areas are denied without clear scientific justification. When ground-penetrating radar reveals structures beneath known sites, proposals to investigate are often rejected or indefinitely delayed. The pattern suggests archaeological access is being managed not purely for scientific reasons but for considerations involving national interest, tourism revenue, or political sensitivities. China's imperial tombs remain largely sealed. The technology exists to excavate and preserve what they contain. International interest is substantial. Yet Chinese authorities restrict access, citing preservation concerns while also controlling narratives about Chinese history that serve current political purposes. What knowledge these tombs contain, what texts and artifacts might challenge or complicate official histories, remains unknown because investigation is prohibited. Military involvement in archaeology creates additional complications. Nazi expeditions seeking ancient artifacts and knowledge are documented historical fact, not conspiracy theory. SS units dedicated resources to archaeological expeditions across multiple continents, searching for objects and information they believed would provide strategic advantage. Cold War interest in ancient technologies by both American and Soviet military researchers is similarly documented. The question is what they found and whether discoveries were classified. Declassified documents reveal government interest in unconventional archaeology. CIA files show research into remote viewing and historical mystery solving. Military funding supported archaeoastronomy research with potential navigation applications. Wars and occupations provided opportunities for government collection of ancient texts and artifacts, not all of which entered public museums or academic study. Some disappeared into classified collections. Some remain there. When American forces entered Baghdad in 2003, Special Forces units received orders to protect the National Museum. They arrived after looters had already breached the facility. Thousands of artifacts disappeared, including ancient tablets from Mesopotamian collections. What was taken? What was recovered? What might have been deliberately targeted? These questions remain incompletely answered. The chaos provided cover. Whether that cover was exploited remains a matter of speculation, supported by gaps in the official account. Strategic archaeology emerges as a pattern. Governments control archaeological information for diplomatic reasons. Discoveries that might give negotiating advantage to rivals are kept secret. Cultural heritage becomes entangled with national security concerns in ways that restrict knowledge access for reasons having nothing to do with scientific caution or artifact preservation. Military satellite imagery has revealed ancient sites before public release, giving military analysts first knowledge of locations that civilian archaeologists later rediscover. Naval operations have detected underwater structures that official reports mention briefly, if at all. Army Corps of Engineers projects on military installations have uncovered artifacts and sites that receive limited disclosure because the bases remained classified or sensitive. The theory emerges that certain ancient technologies might have modern applications. Ancient incendiary weapons described in historical texts inspiring modern research into chemical warfare. Crystalline technologies mentioned in various ancient sources being investigated for optical and communication uses. Acoustic properties of ancient structures potentially having weapon or communication applications. If these technologies work, if ancient descriptions point toward recoverable capabilities, military research likely pursues them without public disclosure. The implications matter. If governments have classified evidence of advanced ancient technology, humanity is being denied its own history for strategic reasons. If ancient texts describe working technologies dismissed as mythology, military organizations may be recovering these capabilities while civilian science remains deliberately uninformed. If access to sites is restricted for political rather than scientific reasons, knowledge that could advance human understanding remains deliberately concealed. Recent developments provide limited transparency. Satellite imagery availability allows independent researchers to find sites that governments might prefer remain hidden. Freedom of Information Act releases reveal past government interest in archaeological mysteries, though heavily redacted. Military veterans occasionally disclose discoveries made at classified sites after those locations are declassified for unrelated reasons, but the fundamental pattern persists. When archaeology intersects with government interest, access becomes restricted, findings become classified, and knowledge that should belong to humanity becomes the property of state security apparatus. Ancient knowledge survived 5,000 years on clay tablets, baked earth preserving information across millennia, readable by anyone who learned the script. Your digital files will be unreadable in 20 years. The formats will become obsolete. The software to access them will cease to exist, and the corporations controlling cloud storage could delete everything tomorrow with a policy change or bankruptcy. This is the paradox of the digital age: more information accessible than ever before, yet more fragile, more controlled, more subject to disappearance than anything carved in stone. Digitization projects are making ancient manuscripts available globally. Museum collections going online. Archaeological databases accessible to researchers anywhere. Citizen scientists analyzing data, making discoveries, contributing to knowledge without institutional affiliation. Social media allows researchers to bypass traditional publishing, sharing findings directly with interested audiences. This is unprecedented democratization, theoretically, but algorithms curate what you actually see. Search engines determine which historical information gets promoted to the first page and which disappears into obscurity beyond the 10th. Wikipedia's volunteer editor structure means historical articles can be dominated by whoever has time and motivation to control the narrative. YouTube's recommendation algorithms might suppress academic content that challenges consensus, favoring entertainment over education, conventional narratives over challenging evidence. Funding platforms can deny service to archaeological projects deemed too controversial, not because the research is invalid, but because it challenges comfortable assumptions or offends particular constituencies. The digital infrastructure that should enable independent investigation actually creates new choke points, new forms of control, more efficient than anything previous eras achieved. We have more historical data available than ever, but most people encounter only what algorithms decide to show them. Information bubbles as restrictive as ancient priest classes' knowledge monopolies, except now they are invisible, personalized, adaptive. You think you are researching freely while the system quietly guides you toward acceptable conclusions and away from uncomfortable questions. Academic journals require fees that exclude general public access. Research funded by taxpayers gets locked behind paywalls that only institutions can afford. Digital repositories restrict access to credentialed researchers. Databases control who can view certain archaeological records. The gatekeeping continues, merely shifted to digital infrastructure that appears open but functions restrictively. Commercial interests shape what gets presented as historical truth. Tourism industries pressure authorities to maintain conventional narratives about popular sites because controversy reduces visitors. Entertainment media creates public perception through dramatized history that prioritizes narrative over accuracy. Museum exhibits reflect donor preferences and government interests more than pure scholarship. The story told is the story that serves economic and political purposes. Physical books last centuries. Digital storage becomes obsolete in decades. Centralized repositories create single points of failure. Cloud-based knowledge depends on continued corporate existence and policy decisions beyond anyone's control. We are transferring human heritage to systems designed for profit and convenience, not preservation. Artificial intelligence offers potential for unprecedented discovery. Pattern recognition in ancient texts that humans miss. Translation capabilities making obscure languages accessible. Analysis of archaeological data at scales impossible manually. But AI can also be programmed to suppress particular interpretations, to flag controversial research, to guide inquiry away from questions deemed inappropriate. The theory emerges that digital technology enables surveillance of historical inquiry that ancient keepers could only dream of, every search query tracked, every access logged, patterns of interest identified and potentially flagged, controversial research suppressed algorithmically before it reaches critical mass. Control through architecture rather than explicit censorship. Yet decentralized technologies offer counterforce. Blockchain creating permanent records that cannot be altered or deleted. Peer-to-peer networks distributing information beyond central control. Global connectivity making total suppression nearly impossible because someone somewhere will preserve and share what others want hidden. We sit at a critical juncture. Digital technology will either enable unprecedented recovery of hidden historical knowledge, democratizing access and accelerating discovery, or it will create new forms of information control more effective and invisible than any previous system. Both processes are happening simultaneously. Which prevails will determine whether humanity finally recovers its hidden past, or loses even the fragments that survived 5,000 years on clay. Roman concrete from 2,000 years ago still stands in structures exposed to seawater, weather, and time. Modern concrete begins crumbling after 50 years under similar conditions. For centuries, this was simply accepted as a mystery. Then in 2023, researchers finally understood why. The Romans used a specific volcanic ash that reacts with seawater to create crystalline structures that actually strengthen over time. We had lost not just a recipe but a principle, that building materials could be designed to improve with age rather than degrade. This is not ancient mystery. This is lost engineering knowledge being recovered through modern analysis of what survived. The technology was real, the knowledge was sophisticated, and it disappeared not because it was impossible to preserve, but because civilizations fell and the information they maintained was not adequately transmitted to successors. Precision stone cutting represents another category of lost capability. Ancient Egyptian and Incan stonework displays tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Modern attempts to replicate this using period-appropriate tools consistently fail, not approximately fail. They cannot achieve the precision visible in structures thousands of years old. Either our understanding of their tools is wrong, or they possess techniques we have not recovered. Experimental archaeology is making progress, discovering that combinations of materials and methods we had not considered can achieve surprising results, but full replication remains elusive. Metallurgical knowledge was lost and is being partially recovered. Damascus steel's precise composition and manufacturing process were forgotten. Ancient alloys display properties that modern materials science struggles to explain fully. Analysis reveals sophisticated understanding of heat treatment, carbon distribution, crystal structure manipulation. This was not accidental capability. It was systematic knowledge applied deliberately to achieve specific material properties. What we haven't recovered may be more significant than what we have. Certain ancient dyes produced colors that modern chemistry cannot reproduce using known historical ingredients. Musical instruments from antiquity display acoustic properties but remain mysterious. Optical devices described in ancient texts sound impossible, yet medieval accounts suggest they functioned. These may represent technologies relying on principles we've abandoned or never pursued rather than capabilities beyond human achievement. The controversial claims require more careful examination. Acoustic levitation appears in multiple ancient traditions and texts, described with sufficient consistency to suggest something beyond pure mythology, yet no conclusive evidence exists. Wireless electricity transmission, which Tesla claimed was recovering ancient knowledge rather than inventing new capability, remains intriguing but unproven. Optical technologies far beyond what we attribute to ancient peoples appear in descriptions that could be metaphorical or literal. These deserve investigation rather than dismissal, but they also demand evidence rather than assumption. Recovering lost technologies matters for practical reasons. Ancient solutions might be more sustainable than modern equivalents. Roman concrete's longevity and lower environmental impact make it attractive for modern green building. Ancient agricultural techniques that maintained soil fertility for centuries offer alternatives to industrial methods that deplete land within generations. Medical treatments using natural compounds are being validated and adopted when modern analysis confirms their effectiveness. The most valuable lost technologies might be the least spectacular: water purification and distribution systems that functioned without electricity, building methods that created structures lasting millennia without modern materials, agricultural approaches that sustained populations without artificial fertilizers or pesticides. These practical capabilities, proven by survival, may be more important than advanced weaponry or exotic devices that attract attention but serve limited purposes. Modern efforts to recover ancient knowledge combine historical research with scientific analysis. Experimental archaeology reconstructs techniques through trial and testing. Materials science reverse engineers ancient alloys by analyzing surviving examples. Interdisciplinary collaboration brings together historians who understand the texts and scientists who can test whether described processes actually work. The greatest obstacle to recovery is not technical but cultural. Modern assumptions that ancient peoples were primitive prevent serious investigation of evidence, suggesting sophisticated capability. Academic incentive structures discourage research challenging consensus. Funding flows toward conventional questions rather than unconventional possibilities. The knowledge may be recoverable, but the will to recover it must overcome centuries of condescension toward ancestors whose achievements we've systematically underestimated. Ancient Indian texts describe chakras, energy centers in the human body aligned along the spine. For centuries, Western science dismissed this as mysticism. Then endocrinologists noticed something peculiar. The locations described for chakras correspond with remarkable accuracy to the positions of major endocrine glands: the pineal, the thyroid, the adrenal, the reproductive glands. The ancients had mapped the body's hormonal system without microscopes, without biochemistry, using only observation and introspective practice. They called it spiritual anatomy. We call it neurobiology. The knowledge is the same. Egyptian texts describe consciousness surviving bodily death, journeying through stages of transformation. Pure mythology, we assumed. Then research into near-death experiences began finding consistent patterns across cultures and centuries. People reporting similar phenomena regardless of religious background or cultural conditioning. Modern neuroscience struggles to explain these consistent experiences within purely materialist frameworks. The Egyptian texts, when read carefully, describe psychological and neurological processes that modern research is only beginning to document. Greek philosophers anticipated quantum mechanics' observer effect, the strange finding that consciousness appears to influence physical measurement. They proposed that mind and matter are not separate categories but interconnected aspects of a unified reality. 2,000 years later, physics experiments confirm that observation affects outcomes at quantum scales. The ancients lacked the mathematics we use to describe it, but they grasped the principle. This knowledge was suppressed for reasons having nothing to do with whether it was true. Understanding that individual consciousness can access profound truth without institutional mediation threatens all hierarchical authority. Religious and political structures depend on maintaining themselves as necessary intermediaries between people and meaning. Knowledge that anyone can directly experience cosmic truth, that consciousness has inherent capabilities beyond what social control permits, represents danger to those whose power depends on monopolizing access to the sacred. Meditation and yoga techniques from Eastern traditions were suppressed in the West for centuries as pagan practices. Yet modern neuroscience confirms they produce measurable, lasting changes in brain structure and function, increased cortical thickness in attention and emotional regulation areas, enhanced neuroplasticity, improved cognitive performance. The ancients called it enlightenment. We call it neuroplasticity. The capability is identical. Natural psychoactive compounds used in ancient religious rites were demonized and prohibited. Recent research demonstrates therapeutic benefits for depression, trauma, addiction. The ancients used these substances sacredly, with ritual and intention. Modern medicine is rediscovering their value under controlled conditions. The knowledge was not superstition, it was pharmacology embedded in spiritual practice. Contemplative traditions across cultures developed independently yet arrived at similar practices and insights. This suggests universal human capacity for expanded consciousness, rather than culturally specific delusion. The consistency points toward genuine discovery of internal capabilities that exist independent of belief systems. If ancient peoples possessed sophisticated understanding of consciousness that was suppressed, humanity has operated under incomplete paradigms for centuries. If techniques for expanding awareness were deliberately restricted, we have been prevented from accessing capabilities that represent our birthright as conscious beings. If ancient cosmological models contain insights modern science is rediscovering, our vaunted progress is partially recovery of what was known and forgotten. This knowledge remains controversial because it threatens foundational assumptions. Materialist science has difficulty accommodating consciousness and subjective experience. Acknowledging that ancients understood things we are only rediscovering undermines modern cultural superiority narratives. Opening investigation into suppressed knowledge domains risks validating what mainstream culture has spent centuries dismissing as primitive superstition. The most dangerous ancient knowledge was not technological. It was the understanding that consciousness is fundamental, that individual awareness can access truth directly, that reality is more malleable and consciousness more powerful than we commonly believe. This knowledge undermines every structure depending on restricting access to truth, on maintaining knowledge monopolies, on controlling what people are permitted to understand about their own nature and potential. Evidence accumulates that this knowledge is being rediscovered. Mainstream research into meditation and consciousness, medical interest in psychedelic therapy previously prohibited, physics exploring whether consciousness plays a fundamental role in quantum mechanics. Growing recognition that indigenous wisdom traditions contain genuine insights rather than primitive misunderstanding, yet resistance persists. Funding for consciousness research faces challenges. Scientists exploring unconventional territories risk professional consequences. Cultural discomfort with ideas challenging materialist assumptions creates barriers to investigation. The pattern of ancient suppression continues in modern forms. Knowledge empowering individuals over institutions faces resistance. Understanding challenging established paradigms requires overwhelming evidence for acceptance. Full recovery would mean validating ancient wisdom traditions that modern culture dismissed. Recognition that human potential extends beyond what materialist paradigms acknowledge. Understanding that hidden knowledge was not primarily technical secrets, but profound truths about consciousness and reality that each generation must discover, that cannot be simply transmitted, but must be experienced to be truly known. Ancient civilizations possessed sophisticated knowledge across multiple domains. This knowledge was systematically hidden and restricted through various means. Much was lost through conquest and catastrophe. Fragments survived through secret transmission, and patterns of knowledge control persist into the modern era. These are not theories. These are documented patterns emerging from evidence scattered across continents and millennia. What this means for how we understand ourselves is profound. Human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than conventional history acknowledges. Progress has not been linear but cyclical, with periods of remarkable advancement followed by catastrophic regression. Our ancestors were not primitive. They possessed capabilities and understanding we are only now recovering, and in some cases have not yet recovered. Recognizing that ancient peoples were our cognitive equals or superiors challenges modern cultural superiority. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are one point in a much longer story of advancement and loss. Understanding that valuable knowledge disappeared makes us recognize our own fragility. What we know today could be forgotten tomorrow if we fail to preserve and transmit it properly. Discovering that suppression continues makes us question what current institutions might be hiding. What knowledge remains restricted for reasons having nothing to do with protecting us. But there is optimism in this recognition. We live at a unique moment. Technology enables unprecedented recovery of ancient knowledge through analysis that previous generations could not perform. Interdisciplinary collaboration allows integration of insights from multiple traditions. Growing questioning of established narratives creates openness to reconsideration. The barriers are weakening. The knowledge is becoming accessible. What recovery could mean practically matters. Ancient sustainable technologies could address modern environmental challenges. Recovered medical knowledge might provide therapeutic approaches less dependent on pharmaceutical industries. Ancient understanding of consciousness could enhance human well-being and capability. This is not just historical curiosity. This is potentially transformative knowledge for addressing contemporary problems. The responsibility this creates is clear. Continue investigation despite resistance. Preserve and share recovered knowledge rather than restricting it. Learn from ancient patterns of knowledge loss to avoid repeating them. Do not allow what we recover to be hidden again by new gatekeepers maintaining new monopolies. Not every claim about ancient knowledge will prove true. Critical evaluation remains essential. But dismissing all evidence because some claims are exaggerated means losing genuine insights. The truth requires both skepticism and openness, distinguishing between fringe speculation and legitimate mysteries. Recognizing that conventional skepticism and alternative credulity both miss nuance, that reality lies between extremes. Ethical questions emerge. Who controls access to recovered knowledge? How should sensitive information be handled? What responsibility exists to share rather than hoard what we discover? These questions matter because the patterns of ancient suppression suggest that concentration of knowledge in few hands, regardless of intention, leads eventually to loss or misuse. Practical challenges persist. Funding for unconventional research, academic resistance to paradigm shifts, political complexities when investigation challenges national or religious narratives. These barriers exist and cannot be ignored, but they also can be navigated, overcome, worked around by those sufficiently motivated. Humanity's forgotten past contains knowledge potentially valuable for our future. Recovering it requires both skepticism and openness. The patterns that hid it historically continue in new forms today. Understanding this allows us to recognize and resist those patterns. What can you do? Support open, access scholarship. Question conventional narratives while maintaining critical thinking. Learn about ancient cultures and their achievements. Recognize that history is still being written and rewritten as new evidence emerges. Understand that you are part of this story, that the recovery of ancient knowledge happens through millions of individual moments of curiosity, investigation, and sharing. The story told here is incomplete because the evidence is incomplete. New discoveries continually revise understanding. The full truth about ancient knowledge will emerge only through continued research by scholars and interested individuals worldwide. The work is not finished, it has barely begun. If our ancestors could hide knowledge for thousands of years through deliberate encoding and secret transmission, what else might be hidden in plain sight? What are you walking past without recognizing? What patterns have you absorbed without questioning? What capabilities do you possess that you have been taught to ignore? The greatest secret of ancient empires might be this: they knew we would forget, and they left behind a map for those wise enough to follow it. That map exists in the monuments they built, the texts they encoded, the traditions they established. It exists in the questions that conventional answers do not satisfy. It exists in your suspicion that the official story is incomplete. The knowledge is there, waiting. The only question is whether we are ready to truly see it.